Good morning. The Journal of Environmental Law and Litigation, the University of Oregon School of Law, Environmental and Natural Resources Center, the University of Oregon Resilience Initiative, and the Oregon State Bar Sustainable Futures section welcomes you to the 2019 legislative session, Carbon Reductions on the Agenda. My name is Elise Williard, and I am the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Environmental Law and Litigation. Today's event will explore Oregon's path into the Western Climate Initiative, a collaborative effort between California and Quebec to sustainably reduce carbon pollution. Thank you for joining us today. We have a terrific group of panelists who can orient us as Oregon moves into this year's legislative session. Now I have the pleasure to introduce Dean Marcelin Burke, the Dave Frohnmeyer Chair in Leadership and Law. Dean Burke came to Oregon Law in July 2017, becoming the first Black female dean in the law school's 134-year history. Before arriving in Eugene, she was the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs at the University of Houston Law Center. During 2009 to 2013, she served the Obama administration and the U.S. Department of Interior. Initially, she was appointed as Deputy Director for Programs and Policy for the Bureau of Land Management. President Obama later appointed her as Acting Assistant Secretary for Land and Minerals Management, where she oversaw 4 bureaus, including the BLM. Following her service at DOI, she returned to the University of Houston Law Center, where she had been a member of the faculty since 2012. Dean Burke earned her bachelor's degree from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, having been named Phi Beta Kappa. She then earned her law degree from Yale University, where she was an editor for both Yale Journal of Law and Feminism and the Law Journal of International Law. She clerked for the Honorable Raymond A. Jackson of the Eastern District of Virginia, and later joined the law firm of Cleary, Gottlieb, Steen, and Hamilton, where her practice focused on environmental law, antitrust, and civil and criminal litigation. Dean Burke was also a visiting professor of law at Rutgers University in Camden, New Jersey in 2001. Her scholarly works have included features in the Notre Dame Law Review, the University of Cincinnati Law Review, and the Duke Environmental Law and Policy Forum. Please welcome Dean Burke.
Good morning, and thank you for that fulsome introduction. I am so pleased to welcome you all here to the University of Oregon this morning, and our discussion today could not be more timely. As we all know, next week the legislature will convene for the 2019 legislative session, and top of the to-do list is the consideration of a new climate policy for the state. This policy promises to cut the state's emissions of heat-trapping gases by 80% by mid-century, demonstrating how one state can do its share to fight this urgent threat of climate change. Just a few months ago, the Global Change Research Program, which is it's a federal effort supported by 13 federal agencies, released its 2018 National Climate Assessment. And that assessment found that climate change is transforming where and how we live and presents growing challenges to human health and quality of life, the economy, and the natural systems that support us. For Oregon in particular, this assessment noted a litany of climate impacts: reduced snowpack, more drought, extreme heat, and something that we're all keenly aware of, more wildfires. Wildfires, as you know, are occurring in the West with both greater frequency and greater intensity. In November, Northern California experienced the worst wildfire in the state's history. The Camp Fire spanned over 150,000 acres. Just take a moment to think about that. 150,000 acres, destroyed almost 19,000 structures, and most devastatingly, caused the loss of at least 86 civilian lives. We know that climate change is an issue that must be addressed now. The energy infrastructure that we invest in, the communities that we build, the transportation systems we design, all of these are either going to be a part of the solution or part of the problem. The decisions we make today are going to determine the world in which we live tomorrow. And fortunately, our state and localities and other localities are stepping up to address climate change. And when I was in the Obama administration, one of the great frustrations, and there were many, but one of the great frustrations was the fact that I can count on one hand the number of times I was able to officially say climate change, the number of times I was able to officially write climate change. In fact, we were preparing for an internal climate change conference in Park City, Utah. And on my way out of town, I had to revise my PowerPoint presentation to take those words out, right? And why did we do that? Was it that we didn't think this was real or important or urgent? We did it because we were afraid. Who were we afraid of? Congress, right? Our appropriations, right? We were afraid, and it was quite literally that they were examining what we were doing to the degree that an expense report that said, I'm going to the climate change conference was a problem. So indeed, I'm thrilled to be among the states, a resident in a state that is stepping up to address this issue at this time. I'm especially thrilled to be at Oregon Law. We know that the resources that a major research institution can bring to bear are vital to the effective response to climate change. And with today's convening, and man, am I excited about how full this room is. This is awesome. Today, we can help support the state's efforts to find solutions and productive paths forward. And we hope that our school's capabilities can be a resource for Oregon's dedicated policymakers as they do this work. And I want to acknowledge that events like today would not be nearly as meaningful if we didn't actually have the participation of our policymakers and the experts that you'll hear from this morning. I want to thank Senator Michael Denbrough. I saw him earlier ride in. There he is in the back. And Representative Karin Power, I don't know if she's made it in yet. She is over there. Thank you so much. You know, they are key leaders in the development of our state's policy, and I appreciate them taking the time from their busy schedules to be here with us today. We're also scheduled to have Kristen Sheeran from Governor Kate Brown's office. Is she here yet? There she is. Thank you, Kristen, for coming. And a special thank you to Elizabeth Mackay from the Government of Quebec. Over there. And this I'm going to need help with, Rajinder Sahota from the California Air Resources Board. And Andrew McKeon, who is the Executive Director of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, here in the front. So I want to thank you all for traveling to be here today and share your experience and your insight. I also want to thank Joe Kruger of the Georgetown Climate Center for being here. Where's Joe? Over there. And the Georgetown Climate Center has been very helpful to states who are wrestling with these issues, and so we welcome your expertise and experience today. I also want to acknowledge other legislators in attendance. I know I spoke with Representative Helm earlier. Where did he find his seat? Up front. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I think I've mentioned all of the legislators that we know are here today, but we, again, are grateful for your participation. And finally, I want to acknowledge the organizers and co-sponsors of this event. Thank you to the Oregon Bar Sustainable Future Section, the UO, the University of Oregon's Resilience Initiative, both as co-sponsors. And last but not least, the Journal of Environmental Law and Litigation. I'd like for all of those students to stand. I know they weren't ready for that. But they have done incredible work. Thank you so much in organizing this event. And then I'd like to acknowledge Professor Greg Dotson, who is the faculty leader of our Environmental and Natural Resources Center's Energy Law and Policy Project. And his leadership in this area of climate law and policy really brings tremendous strength to the law school and our ability to help provide solutions to our communities to the most complex of problems. And finally, I want to thank Heather Britton, our director, and Apple Gerkner for their efforts, always doing a great job for the center. So I think we have a tremendous discussion ahead of us today, and I just want to again thank you and welcome you to the University of Oregon.
Thank you so much, Dean Burke. Good morning, everyone. My name is Zoe Grant. I'm a third-year law student at Oregon Law, and I'm also the Operations and Articles Editor for the Journal of Environmental Law and Litigation. I'm pleased to be here to introduce our next speaker. Professor Gregory Dotson is a faculty member with the University of Oregon's Environmental and Natural Resource Law Center. He served as an energy and environmental policy staffer in the U.S. House of Representatives from 1996 to 2014, where he worked on numerous pieces of energy and climate change legislation. He now teaches climate change law and policy, and as Dean Burke mentioned, also works with our Energy Law and Policy Project. As a 1995 graduate of Oregon Law, we are so happy to have him back on our Eugene campus, and he will be providing a brief presentation about why we're discussing climate change today and its particular relevance here in Oregon. Please welcome Professor Greg Dotson.
Good morning, I'm Greg Dotson. Let me join Dean Burke and welcome you to our symposium this morning. I'm going to talk for about 10 minutes on the topic of climate change and Oregon's new proposed policy. That's a short period of time for a complex and extremely important topic. I'm going to try to get us all on the same page with 10 slides in 10 minutes. We have a knowledgeable audience, so I don't need to spend time explaining the science or urgency of climate change. I'll just note that in the plain yet ominous language of scientists participating in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, if the world doesn't act to do more to cut emissions, then we will face a high to very high risk of severe, widespread, and irreversible impacts globally. You can learn more about climate change, how climate change is affecting drought, wildfires, extreme precipitation, national security, and Oregon specifically by checking out the Oregon Climate Change Research Institute, the U.S. Global Change Research Program, and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Now, over the next few minutes, I'm going to tell a story that begins 40 years ago in the Adirondack Mountains of New York. It's a story of innovation and problem solving. In the 1980s, American coal-fired power plants were sending up vast clouds of sulfur dioxide, which was falling back to the earth in the form of acid rain, damaging lakes, forests, and buildings across eastern Canada and the United States. For nearly a decade, Congress sought a policy to address the problem. The issue seemed intractable as policy proposals were considered and ultimately rejected. Then Congress passed the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990 and established a new acid rain program. The acid rain program is based on the concept of emissions trading, which has become better known as cap and trade. It was championed by a Republican White House, passed by a Democratic Congress, and signed into law by President George H.W. Bush. The premise of cap and trade is that government doesn't tell sources of pollution how to clean up their act. Instead, it simply imposes an overall limitation on the aggregate emissions from all of the entities to which it applies. This is known as a cap on pollution, and each company starts the year with a certain number of tons they are allowed to emit. The company decides how to use these allowed tons, which are known as allowances. The company might switch to a cleaner fuel, it might buy a scrubber to cut emissions. If it doesn't use up its allowance, it might sell what it no longer needs. Then again, it might have to buy extra allowances on the open market. So each year, the cap ratchets down, and the shrinking pool of allowances become more valuable, encouraging further investment in pollution reduction. Prior to the acid rain program, this policy idea was theoretically sound, but there was no successful demonstration of it in practice. There were skeptics in government, business, and the environmental community, and you still hear some skepticism today. Well, so how well did it work? Let's look at this map from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. The size of the circles you see depict the amount of sulfur dioxide air pollution from each state in 1990. In total, it amounted to about 16 million tons of pollution released into the atmosphere. By 1995, the cap on sulfur dioxide pollution went into effect, and pollution dropped by 3 million tons alone in that year, even faster than required. The program was working, and it was strengthened over time in a complicated set of EPA rulemakings, which I will not attempt to explain. This map shows what happened by 2015. Pollution had decreased to less than 3 million tons in total. Not unexpectedly, acid rain deposition dropped dramatically as a result of the program. And these benefits were realized without enforcement actions, without regulators having to conduct inspections of facilities, and at a fraction of the projected cost. They had thought it would be up to $25 billion per year to do this program. It ended up being around $3 billion. Essentially, what the government had done was create scarcity for the right to emit sulfur dioxide. And because that right was scarce, it became valued. And that value increased over time as the rights to emit sulfur dioxide became even more scarce. In effect, the Clean Air Act had put a price on sulfur dioxide. Throughout the 1990s, the scientific understanding of climate change grew. The concerns became strong enough that the U.S. joined a treaty pledging to cut emissions with every other country in the world. In fact, the treaty was ratified without any objection by the U.S. Senate. Republicans and Democrats supported it. By the end of the 1990s, there was a growing appreciation that cap and trade might be a useful tool for addressing climate change. By putting a price on carbon, you'd create the right incentives to reduce carbon pollution. But policymakers came up with a wrinkle. In the acid rain program, the allowances to emit were provided free of charge. You'll sometimes hear that referred to as free allowances. And policymakers asked, well, why should that be free? You know, when broadcasters use a limited public resource, when they transmit radio and television, and in order to ensure that the public is compensated for the use of that public resource and that airwaves aren't crowded with overlapping broadcasts, the government auctions the rights to the spectrum. And the thought was if government auctioned at least some of the allowances to emit carbon pollution, the revenues from those auctions could be used to make needed investments. So cap and trade could be thought of under this approach as cap and invest. In 2007, Oregon contemplated doing just that. But the legislature decided not to take that step. Instead, the legislature decided on a bipartisan basis to set non-binding goals for carbon pollution reduction. This chart is from Oregon's Global Warming Commission, and it shows the state's greenhouse gas emissions by year. Historic emissions are represented by the blue line you see on the upper left, and sure enough, the state has been able to reduce emissions from the peak that occurred in 1999. You can see the bipartisan 2007 goals for 2020 and 2050 represented by the yellow line declining off to the right. But unfortunately, emissions have gone up in the last couple of years, and the red line is a current projection of where our emissions are headed. As you can see, and as experts have confirmed, the state is not on track to meet its goals for pollution reduction. So without additional action, Oregon is projected to exceed its goal for the year 2020 by perhaps 10 million tons, and to exceed its goal for the year 2050 by 45 million tons. This is one of the reasons I think legislators are now revisiting the question of whether to establish a pollution policy that requires a reduction in pollution. Where are these emissions coming from? Here's a chart from the Oregon Department of Energy showing the source of Oregon's carbon emissions. As you can see, the vast majority of emissions are from transportation, electricity, natural gas, buildings, and industry. These are the kinds of sources envisioned to be covered by a cap and invest program. While Oregon did not move forward with such a program in 2007, other states did. Today, there are 10 states that have adopted cap and invest programs, and they've been using the proceeds from these markets to drive investments in renewable energy, energy efficiency, affordable and sustainable housing, and other priorities. 9 northeastern states participate in what is known as the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI. This program applies solely to the electricity sector in those states. The program auctions a declining amount of pollution allowances periodically, and in so doing has generated billions of dollars in revenue while cutting pollution by 40%. This program has been so successful that neighboring states are now considering participating in RGGI as well. California established a program that applies to carbon pollution from a larger set of sources, including industrial sources and the transportation sector. They participate in this program with the Canadian province of Quebec, and it is known as the Western Climate Initiative. California is enjoying leading economic growth and innovation as they foster a cleaner environment. They've used revenue from their program to invest in every county in their state. Although the geographic area covered by these 10 states is small compared to the entire country, the fact is 25% of the nation's population, 1/3 of all the economic activity today occurs in under some sort of cap and invest program. And importantly, the states that have established these programs happen to be enjoying economic growth that exceeds the national average. So just like Acid Rain program taught us that cap and trade is an effective and innovative way to cut pollution, these state programs have shown us that implementing cap and invest at the state level for carbon pollution can cut pollution while providing needed resources. And these states are not alone. Carbon pricing is happening around the world. This chart is from the World Bank. They found that 88 governments representing more than 1/2 of the global emissions are now considering or planning to put a price on carbon. Currently, there are 51 carbon pricing initiatives being implemented around the world. In fact, Oregon's largest international trading partners are China, Canada, Malaysia, Japan, and South Korea. 4 out of 5 of these trading partners have embraced putting a price on carbon. So what is the legislature considering? In 2019, the governor and the leaders in the Oregon legislature have said they intend to consider the Clean Energy Jobs Bill. This bill would require the biggest sources of emissions to pay for their pollution. What do I mean by the biggest sources? Those emitting 25,000 tons of carbon pollution, the equivalent to burning 133 rail cars of coal each year. Big sources. The legislature has a number of important decisions to make. In crafting the legislation, policymakers will have to make judgments and come to conclusions about how to handle the revenue, how to balance auctioning allowances versus directly providing allowances, how to adapt the policy to concerns specific to Oregon. There are many different approaches that could have the same environmental outcomes but could significantly affect the state in different ways and could either add to or subtract from the support the program ultimately receives from the public and our businesses. On a final important note, cap and trade or cap and invest programs have never been seen as appropriate for capping biological sources of carbon, such as forestry. Forests, they absorb a lot of carbon, they emit a lot of carbon, and it just doesn't match the same simplicity associated with putting a carbon monitor on a power plant. So, however, forestry and agricultural practices can sequester carbon, and that should be encouraged. And so the legislature will have to consider how best to incentivize climate-friendly land management as part of this as well. That's my brief presentation of how we got here today. I'm really looking forward to today's panelist discussions, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Professor Dotson. Good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to see so many friends of Oregon Law here this morning. My name is Camille Creer, and I am a second-year law student at the University of Oregon School of Law. I currently serve as a staff editor on the Journal of Environmental Law and Litigation. I'm excited to introduce Joe Kruger, who will be moderating our first panel on experience with existing state and provincial programs. Joe is the Director for Research and Strategy at the Georgetown Climate Center. Previously, he has consulted with companies, nonprofits, and state governments on climate policy and sustainability issues. From 2005 to 2014, he was the director at the Bipartisan Policy Center and its predecessor, the National Commission on Energy Policy. In 2009, he served as the Deputy Associate Director for Energy and Climate Change at the White House Council on Environmental Quality. George has an impressive background on climate policy, and I encourage you all to check out the program for further details on his background. Please join me in welcoming Joe Kruger.
of all, thank you for that great introduction. Thanks to the University of Oregon, Greg and Dean Burke, and everyone else who helped put this together. This is a really great event. I'm very excited and honored to be invited to participate in it. Before kicking off this great panel, I wanted to say a few words about the breadth and scope of what states are doing on climate change and clean energy. I think Greg gave a great overview of some of the marquee programs and kind of the history of the development of cap and trade and cap and invest programs. And we'll hear more about this from our panelists who are leaders in their states and programs. But it's also important to note there's a wide cross-section of states who are involved in a variety of activities in addition to cap and trade and cap and invest. And these are states led by Democratic and Republican governors. There's a number of interesting things going on across a lot of different sectors. Just for example, 29 states in Washington, D.C. have renewable portfolio standards. States are also leading on energy efficiency programs of a large number of types, from regulatory structures that incentivize energy efficiency and take away disincentives for doing energy efficiency, to building codes, to all sorts of additional things. States are leading on electrification of buildings, beneficial electrification where it reduces emissions from the building sector. There are programs on methane, reducing methane emissions and nitrous oxide emissions in the agricultural sector, sequestration, as Greg mentioned. There are also programs to reduce methane leaks from oil and gas systems. And I could go on, but my main point is that there are multiple tools that are complementary, in my opinion, to cap and invest, cap and trade programs. And so I didn't want to lose sight of that as we focus on what I feel is one of the critical programs, which is cap and trade or cap and invest program. But there are other policies worth discussing. I think states are leading on these programs because they realize that these types of efforts make economic sense. They lower energy bills. They provide multiple benefits ranging from air quality to economic development and jobs and creation of new markets. And because, as both Greg alluded to and also Dean Burke, because states are feeling the impacts of climate change. In the West, as was mentioned, the wildfires were a real wake-up call, I think. In the East and in the Southeast, massive storms in the past year were really notable. And I can sort of sense a kind of an awakening of public opinion. And so I think that's part of the reason, part of the trend that states are going to continue to really lead on these programs. So finally, I want to talk about transportation. And that was the largest sector, largest segment of that pie chart of emissions. And it's a tough sector to reduce emissions, but there are states who are rolling up their sleeves and engaging in that quite vigorously. And you'll hear some from our panelists in a minute about some of the things going on in their states or provinces. But I wanted to talk about a brand new initiative that was just announced in December on my coast, the east coast of the country. It's called the Transportation and Climate Initiative. And it was announced on December 18th. It was 9 states in the District of Columbia who basically announced that they're developing a cap and invest program for transportation sector emissions. And this was after a long period of stakeholder consultations and over 4 or 5 different states and 500 participants in a stakeholder process. And so what these governors in these states, and I should say 3 of the governors are Republican governors in Massachusetts, Maryland, and Vermont, lead those states. What these governors in their states have agreed to do is over the next year develop a proposal for a cap and invest program in the transportation sector and put that out there. And then once that's developed, they'll make the decision to go ahead regionally with that program. So in their December 18th statement, when they released what they said they were going to undertake this initiative over the course of this year, they cited a number of goals. These will sound familiar, I think, to folks in Oregon. They want to ensure that carbon reduction goals are met while creating healthier and livable communities, create opportunities for jobs and economic growth and new markets, address equity issues, particularly for vulnerable communities, whether it's urban communities or rural communities. That I think both will be addressed in the policy. Enhance the resilience of the transportation systems. States in the East are already starting to feel the need as there are increased impacts of climate change. And finally, sort of as a principle for developing this thing together, they are agreeing to allow individual jurisdictions, individual states, and DC to develop and implement both complementary policies, and then to use the proceeds from the Cap and Invest program to invest in ways that they feel have the biggest benefits and serve their states the best. So over the next year, they'll be developing this program, doing modeling and analysis, designing all the classic cap and trade elements that go into a program, from cap levels to monitoring reporting to cost containment, timelines, and so forth. So lots to do over the next year before that program is fully fleshed out, but it's very exciting, and it shows that transportation is something that states are also engaging with as well. So that's enough from me. Let's now turn to our very distinguished panel, who are associated really with the trailblazing climate policies, I think, in North America. And they all have very impressive bios. I encourage you to read the pamphlet there, more about them. But we just introduce them again. To my left, Rajendra Sahota from the California Air Resources Board. We have Andrew McKeon, who's from Reggie Inc. He can explain what Reggie Inc. Is, as opposed to just Reggie, but it's sort of the same thing.
I'm not sure I can.
And then Elizabeth Mackay, who's a representative of the Quebec government in Los Angeles. So with that, let's start the discussion. And I think since all of the panelists represent jurisdictions that have joined other jurisdictions for climate programs, I'd like to begin with the idea of linkage, the idea of linking the jurisdictions for these cap and trade, cap and invest programs together. You know, economists sometimes argue that bigger is always better for a cap and trade program, bigger markets, more opportunities for trade, and so forth. In practice, I think there are both benefits and challenges to linking to other states and jurisdiction. Let me start with Andrew, I think, because Reggie has the longest experience of linking state cap and trade programs, and ask, what would you say are the biggest challenges, and what are the biggest benefits?
Sure, thank you. Thank you, Joe, and very great opportunity to be here and talk to you a bit about Reggie. Reggie Inc. basically is the non-for-profit 501c3 that runs the auctions, for the quarterly auctions for Reggie. I think there's a WCI Inc. as well that does the same for WCI. So in terms of the sort of the challenges with a program like Reggie, I would say that bringing together 9 sovereign states as we have to work towards a common goal can in and of itself present challenges. We just went through a program review at the end of 2017 where prior to that, a lot of the thinking had been based on the fact that a clean power plan was going to be in place by then, and a lot of planning had been going into and modeling based on that future. And as of the election in 2016, a lot of things changed. And we also had a change in leadership in a number of states. As Joe alluded to, we had a majority Republican governors in the Reggie program. So for us to then be able to move forward by the end of 2017 with this agreement, this consensus to further reduce our cap 30% from 2020 to 2030, I think was a great accomplishment of the leadership of the agency heads of the states. So the big challenge is when you have a consensus-based organization like Reggie, the challenges are getting everyone on board and moving forward. There's no voting, there's no majority rule. It's basically everyone agrees to it or we don't move forward on it. So as I said, with sort of the changes in politics, that has sort of had us go back to the drawing board a number of times, but I guess at the end of the day, and getting back to the benefits, the program has been so beneficial to all the participating states that we have found a way, the states have found a way to move forward and continue the progress of reduction. And those benefits, they've been already alluded to, I think, a few times, but for example, even if the electricity prices have gone up slightly relative to the rest of the country over the period, the actual energy bills, the electricity bills in Reggie have gone down. And that's due to things like energy efficiency, people actually using less energy as a result. The investments being made in taking proceeds from the auctions and putting them back into things like energy efficiency and renewables and other programs have really made the success of Reggie. So I would say the challenges have been, getting everyone to be on the same program and move forward, and the benefits are sort of speak for themselves there.
Great, thank you. And Elizabeth, for Quebec, how was the experience of working with such a large state like California? There's certainly a differential in size there.
Sorry. Thank you, first of all, for having me. I would say that for Quebec, linking with a giant like California was an issue at the beginning because people were saying, why aren't we finding a friend that's more like us and that maybe is not going to eat us up, But but for Quebec, which is a relatively small province, the linking with the jurisdiction of California made sense because it provided stability for the market and made available larger pools of emission units, reductions that could be achieved at lower cost. Some of the advantages that we saw when we wanted to work with the WCI and the cap and trade were that it offered flexibility for the government and the covered emitters. Also, we were assured of an equal to equal partnership, which means that on the board of the WCI, we have equal number of voters, and the decisions are based on consensus-oriented decision-making process. And finally, which was really important to get this thing going, was that we were assured of a continuous collaboration and support from at all levels. That means that we have regular conference calls with California. We have yearly face-to-face meetings. Regularly, we have regular board meetings. So we are very well supported by WCI. So I would say that overall, our partnership with the WCI allowed us to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. It will provide $4 billion of money coming in, new money coming into the province that can be reinvested in developing technologies or adapting to climate change. And finally, it gives us the opportunity of being part of a global solution for a global problem where every one of us is responsible. So that's how we got into this program.
Great, thank you. So a lot of that was a great discussion of some of the benefits of linking, but there are also some programmatic and policy challenges that have come up in linking, in designing these types of regional programs. And I'm curious, Rajinder, how does California, given that there's some logistical challenges, how does it view these challenges and the benefits of linking to other jurisdictions?
And thanks for that question, and thank you to Oregon Law for the invitation to be here and to sit with my fellow panelists. So I looked at the question and I saw challenges, and I don't think I would characterize them as challenges, but I think when you're working at them at the staff level, you think of them as challenges. We now see them as opportunities, and I'm going to give you some history on linkage with Quebec. So back in 2012, we were on the verge of going to our board with a vote or the regulation that would have recognized Quebec's program. 2 weeks before that vote was meant to happen, our legislature came in and said, hold on, you guys, what are you linking and what does this mean for California? And all of a sudden, it was 4 new requirements in state statute about what we needed to do to demonstrate that we were actually ready to link with another jurisdiction. And at no other point in any of our environmental programs had we linked with any other jurisdiction. So this was the first time for any program in California where we're looking at linking an environmental program this closely and tightly with another jurisdiction anywhere. So there was hesitation, there was concern, and there was anxiety. And it was anxiety at the legislature. Staff certainly were like, we hope we get this right. And then we had our industry and our NGO groups who were like, we're going to open the doors. What does this mean? Does this mean that they're going to buy all of our allowances and we're not going to find allowances in the market, and now we're going to have to pay more. So there was all of these swirling questions that were going on. The legislature helped organize this for us in 4 statutory requirements. And so first, one of the things is equivalent stringency. And this is about equivalency in jurisdictional targets, goals, and then stringency in the caps. And this is about eroding the ambition in California. So by linking with a different program, are you going to somehow hurt your chances of hitting your jurisdictional targets? Are there caps binding in that jurisdiction? Are they aligned with the larger climate goals that need to happen? And California, like many states, is part of the United States Climate Alliance, which is a subset of states in response to the federal government pulling out of the Paris Agreement. And so you do have a subset of like-minded states that are looking at taking action to hit those goals. So that's very encouraging. Underneath that, you have some states like Oregon and Washington and some of the states in the Northeast that are looking at specific action, such as potentially a cap and trade program, cap and invest, other direct programs or measures that they can implement. The equivalency question then came back to the scope of the programs. So in California, we have an economy-wide program. We felt it was important for us to have an economy-wide program because if you leave somebody out of the cap, you're inadvertently picking a winner. And for us, the question had been floated early on. Why don't you roll out like Reggie did, try electricity, and then think about everybody else? Well, transportation is one of our biggest sources. It's 50% of the state's emissions, and it continues to grow each year. We're making great progress in some of the other sectors, but if we had left transportation out of our scope of our program, you're essentially giving transportation a pass while you are putting a compliance obligation on electricity, which is really doing a lot of work already to reduce its emissions, and you want that sector to be able to be invested and the infrastructure to be built to electrify buildings and other transportation systems. And so the scope for us mattered at home. When we think about linkage, the question comes back, so staff, you guys have put in all of these programs, you've covered all of these sources. You think it's important to do at home. You're linking with another program. Do they agree with you on this? And if not, how do you justify, and this is a legislative oversight hearing question, how do you justify to us why you are going to put these industries, these sources under a cap and trade regime in California, but it's okay to link with a program that hasn't done this? And so those are the kinds of questions that we get and we have to answer as we're looking at any proposal to link with another jurisdiction. Competitiveness comes in. You know, if we have one industry under the carbon price in California and you're proposing to link with another jurisdiction and they don't, well, won't production just move there because they have a more favorable environmental landscape and no compliance obligation for cap and trade? So you get these questions about economic equivalency, about political equivalency, and then just don't disadvantage us at home relative to somebody else. And these are the political questions that we have to answer. And those always translate back into programmatic, detailed assessments of the other program. We've done this twice. We did it with Quebec, we did it with Ontario, and all of the materials that we have to look at and all of the questions we have to answer are actually available on our website because we generate a report that we then give to the governor's office. Our Department of Justice has to look at the report and then come back to us and say, yes, you looked at all of the tenets of the legislation. Yes, you've demonstrated successfully that the other program is actually going to perform the way that you're saying it is in this report. And so scope, stringency, those are some of the basic ones. And then the question is about the market itself. And a market is only as strong as the weakest link in the market. So we have another report that we have to do. And you know, at first, we're like, how many more reports do we need to do before you guys are comfortable with our technical assessment? There's a lot. But this report really is about, you know, the experience, the systems, the staff expertise of the group in the other jurisdiction that is going to be administering their program. Because once you link, all of your financial information for the market is in the same system. They have access to your data. We have access to their data. So you want to make sure that across the jurisdictions, everybody has a common understanding, common expertise, and that we all understand the sensitivities about what happens if that data is misused, mishandled, or inadvertently released, et cetera. The other part about the market program is enforceability, and that is, are the staff and the agencies that are administering these programs, do they have regulatory oversight and enforcement experience? Because if in California we have a market and we have an entity that puts a reporting error into the system, we've taken fines of up to $500,000 for misreporting of the greenhouse gases. Because once one entity misreports, that plays into how much the supply and demand dynamics are in the overall market. And it does impact the stringency of the linked program, and it impacts potential costs for everybody else in the market. And that's a little different than a traditional command and control program, where one entity, if you make a mistake, you only impact yourself. In a market program, you may be reducing the demand for yourself, but that means you've helped everybody else emit a little bit more. And so these kinds of questions and the kinds of expertise in the systems all have to be assessed for our legislative members and for our NGOs to feel comfortable before we even go to our board and take action to recognize the other program. I'd like to say that, you know, it's always smooth and easy. It's not, because that means we're coming up to speed on the legal structure in the other jurisdiction. The attorneys across the jurisdictions talk, because, you know, statutes and regulations are very different across the jurisdictions. It's a lot of learning on our side about what the other system looks like legally and environmentally, but you also get to work closely with certain staff, and through that process, you build relationships, personal relationships with the other staff, and those pay dividends when you actually have to implement the program. I'll give you an example, and that is when we were going through AB 398 in 2017. That was when the conversation was, what do we do with cap and trade post-2020? There was a lot of rumor, there was a lot of conjecture as to what was going to happen in California. I was on calls maybe once, twice, every day for 3 weeks with my colleagues in Ontario and Quebec at the time. And I needed them for emotional support because there was so much uncertainty going on. But I also needed them to know that there was an open dialogue between all of us, and that we were doing our best at our relationship level to make sure that they did not hear something, or if they did hear something, they had context for it. So these kinds of dynamics you don't usually see in environmental programs, but they come into play. I'm going to mention one more dynamic, and that is stakeholders. Our stakeholders, when we think about linking with somebody, if they're unhappy with any feature of our program, or they have a criticism of our program and they feel like we didn't do it justice enough in the way we designed the program, they go running to that other jurisdiction in a heartbeat. So when Ontario was designing their program and getting ready to link, our stakeholders were calling the government of Ontario, their environment ministry, to tell them what we got wrong. At the same time, and I'm going to be fully honest with all of you, at the same time, as Oregon is looking at legislation and potentially having a cap and invest program, I'm getting calls from Oregon entities and NGOs asking questions about why we did something, why we didn't do something. And so as soon as you start talking about linkage, your universe of stakeholders expands significantly. And this is where communication comes back. You want to make sure that as you're fielding questions that are related to another program, you're either being very quiet because you don't want to get into the middle of whatever's going on because you don't know the landscape back in that jurisdiction, or you're communicating back with your colleagues in the other jurisdiction, getting background so you know what's going on, and that way you can either refer the question to the right person back in the other jurisdiction, or you can give some responsive answer but not get into the middle of some controversial tension that's going on back at home. So these are the kinds of things that happen that you don't anticipate or foresee when you start to think about linkage. But in the end, we've done it twice, so we're able to get through it. We've worked with 2 jurisdictions, and so it's hurdles, it's different, but it's doable. And there are benefits of friendship, there are benefits of professional support group, and there are benefits of actually knowing others are collaborating with you as you think about addressing climate change.
That's great, thank you. I'm wondering, Andrew or Elizabeth, if you have any either reaction to what Virginia said or additional sort of final points on linkage before we move on to another topic.
Well, I was just going to nod about the stakeholders from the other states approaching, because right now we have Virginia and New Jersey seriously considering participating in the program, and we're getting outreach, if not from NGOs in those states, at least from the media, asking us questions about Virginia's program or New Jersey's. And so our policy is to sort of refer them back to those states, but also work with the staff in those states on if they need help with the responses and make sure everything is aligned. But yeah.
Great. Any additional thoughts?
Yeah. I would just like to add that not only is the WCI equal to equal, but it's a system that's been designed to withstand any kind of fluctuations. Rajinder just spoke of Ontario. Ontario came in 2018, in the beginning of the year, and after their June election, pulled out. So once they pulled out, for Quebec and California, there were absolutely no impact. At the first auctions, all the issues were all sold at above the minimum price. So beside being disappointed of Ontario's pulling out, Quebec and Ontario did not feel anything from their withdrawal. So Ontario right now has to deal with its problem, but Quebec and California went through this with no problem. So it shows that the system is very solid, and I think that for the stakeholders, the emitters, and the government, this kind of solidity is quite important.
Maybe just one more sort of thread to that was we had New Jersey leave the program a number of years ago, and that was disruptive, but the program was stable enough, and now we have New Jersey interested in coming back in. So this idea of linkage being, there's a flexibility there, and I think we're happy to have New Jersey come back. We certainly don't want to encourage other states to be jumping in and out, but this idea of linkage is, can have some flexibility in it.
Great. Well, let's move on to another topic. From a consumer perspective, the question that comes up with every cap and trade or cap and invest proposal that I've ever worked on is, how will it affect my costs? And I'd like each of the panelists to address this, and basically, how have your programs affected consumer costs for energy, either in the region-wide or in your state or province? Maybe start with Elizabeth first this time.
So first of all, you have to keep in mind that in Quebec, our electricity is 99.6% comes from clean renewable energy. So it's mainly hydro, of course, and it's abundant, it's clean, and it's cheap. But when we were implementing a carbon pricing, it necessarily plays a role in the observed gas hikes. The gasoline prices are going up, of course. And that's one of the aims of the carbon pricing. However, when you look at the impact on the fuel price of the carbon market, it's really very small compared to the general oil fluctuations that we observe across the years. I mean, you just have to have a long weekend and the price of oil will go up 10 cents. So right now in Quebec, the refineries or the distributors came under the cap and trade in 2015. And at that time, it was evaluated that the impact of the cap and trade was about 4 cents per liter. But like I said, this 4 cents is much smaller than the fluctuations that go on in the market. So even today, the weekly variations at the pump are still more important than the carbon cost on our fuel. In November 18, this last auction, the auction price was around $27, and the impact, $20 Canadian, $15 American. So the impact on the gasoline in Canada was 4.8, and here it was 13 cents per gallon. So we're not talking major when you're looking at how much the distributors can hike the prices themselves. With regards to heating costs, because of the cap and trade, the Quebec government has been able to put in place a number of programs which directly go back to consumers. We have Réno Climat, which is Rénovation Climate. So we help individuals bring their houses to more energy efficient levels by changing doors, windows, or better insulation. And this gives our consumers a 20% rebate on their overall heating costs, which is spread over a number of years, which makes it very livable for them in our place.
Actually, maybe I'll go to Rajinder next.
I think it's always hard to talk about a single policy, especially when in California we've pursued a portfolio approach. And so we have multiple policies. We have a scoping plan that lays out, advanced clean cars, low carbon fuel standard, a renewable portfolio standard, SLCPs, cap and trade. And we just went through that exercise. It took 2 years in 2015 and 2017 to demonstrate how we'll get to our 2030 target. The previous plan was about how do we get to our 2020 target, and I'm actually happy to say that we actually hit the emissions target 4 years early for 2020. So we're ahead of schedule right now, and we think we're going to stay ahead of schedule. But then we have a 40% drop in emissions from 2020 to 2030 that we need to address. But when you look at the suite of policies, and we did an economic analysis, there are costs and savings to the economy and to the households and to jobs. And what we found is that between the business as usual growth that you can expect in the economy in 2030, and when you overlay all these climate policies, because some of them do reduce your energy use, you do see a very negligible change in the impact to the economy and jobs and household expenditures in the state. Less than 1% change than if there were no suite of policies that were overlaid over California. Now, when you think about cap and trade specifically, you have electricity, you have gasoline. Well, with electricity, we have a RPS standard. And in the cap and trade program, we give allowances to our utilities, our electric and gas utilities. They consign those at auction, and twice a year, you get a dividend back on your climate or your energy bill. So there are 2 years out of the year, I don't have to pay anything, but there is a cost for carbon reflected in the energy, but because of that dividend back through the mechanism in the cap and trade program, 2 months out of the year, I don't have to pay anything. For the fuel side, if we are successful in implementing all of our mobile source strategies, the fuel efficiency, advanced clean cars, low carbon fuel standard, we modeled a drop in demand for on-road fossil fuel of 45% between 2015 and 2030. So in the light duty sector, we are pushing deployment and infrastructure build out for EVs. What the price of gasoline looks like shouldn't really matter to most people if we're successful in many of the policies that we're pursuing. The other policy that is critical for us on the energy side is land use and VMT. VMT continues to go up in California. We have sustainable land use policies. If we are successful in implementing those will also help to reduce demand for fossil fuels, but also help with us meeting our air quality mandates because of the combustion-related air toxics and criteria pollutants that combustion engines cause for localized impacts. So I always like to talk about climate impacts and cost impacts looking at the full portfolio, because I think it's incomplete just to focus on one policy. And then within the policy, there are ways to design it to make sure you're buffering some of those impacts. And then the revenue that you generate absolutely is critical when you think about low-income households. And I know we'll talk about that in a little bit. Thank you.
Great. Andrew.
So I was thinking how if we were to represent Reggie the way we are WCI, would need like 8 more chairs on this dais, because there's 9 states. Each of them have their own policies around how they use the proceeds from these auctions, but a number of states do devote proceeds towards lowering electricity bills. Some states take a carve out of the amount from the proceeds directly to all bill payers. Other states do it for more low-income folks. But if you look at the data from before this program started to, I think it's through 2016, electricity prices across the United States have actually gone down. I think it's about 2%, and in Reggie, it's gone down 1%, so maybe a little bit slower. But the bills themselves are actually much more reduced because of these investments in energy efficiency and other things, the proceeds being reinvested in energy efficiency and renewables and things of that nature.
I wanted to look at prices from a slightly different level, and just for the transportation sector. So really this is addressed to Rajinder and Elizabeth. Both of your programs or the WCI addresses transportation fuels, and you sometimes hear the argument that the price in the transportation sector, which we've heard is somewhat modest at the pump, but the flip side to that is, will it be enough to actually influence emissions? And I wonder how you respond to that. Maybe I'll start, Regina, with you this time.
Sure. Transportation is very complicated because it speaks to what you pay at the pump and what it means to your overall expenditures for that month or that week. And so gas prices, even NPR talks about gas prices in Sacramento, and it's not quite clear when they're talking about changes in gas prices if they're excited to see them go up or they're not excited to see them go up, because they just report on gas prices, which I've never figured out why they do it that way. But for transportation, I think when you look at a cap and trade program, what you do is you have a minimum price. And in every sector, there's going to be a different price point at which that sector starts to respond to that carbon price signal. Right now, we're seeing electricity responding very clearly at $15. You have to move up along that cost curve to start to see other sectors start to respond. In the meantime, we can't wait for those prices to get to whatever level it is, because none of us that I know has been able to calculate what that price is. That's that marginal price for a gallon of gasoline when I say I'm going to take the bus and not drive my car today, unless you just say some very high price and then just hammer it back to everybody. But as you're thinking about the time it takes to move along that abatement curve, and thinking about the imperative of the IPCC report, the special report that just came out, having complementary policies that are pushing transformation and pushing it quicker than waiting for that price point to hit is what is going to be necessary here. And so in the IPCC report, it talks about how there's evidence emerging about complementary policies with modest carbon pricing. That is an approach that has been in California since 2008. You have to have those complementary policies with carbon pricing to make sure that you are getting to some of your toughest sectors earlier than later. And so at some point, we're going to get along that abatement curve and we're going to start hitting transportation, but we can't wait. And that's why we have things like the low carbon fuel standard, we have advanced clean cars, and sustainable land use policy that's going on in California.
So, excuse me. In Quebec, of course, the implementation of the cap and trade did have a small impact on the observed price of gasoline. Now we're saying it's not sufficient. If you ask any person in Quebec, they'll say it's too much anyways. But when you think of carbon pricing, you have to think of society as a whole, and in order to achieve the desired greenhouse gas reductions. But you can't have an unfair burden on citizens that live far away from the big centers where they have access to transportation and all kind of systems that people who live far away in the rural sectors have. So the great thing about the cap and trade is that it generates revenue, and that helps us to change habits and to offer alternatives. So in Quebec, the revenues are used to encourage sustainable mobility. They fund rebate programs for the purchase of EV cars, old and new, because we know that people who are fortunate enough to buy these EV cars, that's great, but some of the older cars are most of the problems. So you have to help the people who can't afford the new electric cars buy. So we have put in place a program to buy used electric cars. We're installing electric charging stations across the province, and we're supporting companies to develop a green tech space that have, and they're developing many promising technologies. So I believe that with a balanced approach, we're going to be able to attain the greenhouse gas reductions with incentives and changing our habits of getting around. But I don't think we're going to get rid of the cars, so we're needing new technologies to replace these.
Well, we've started to touch on the issue of revenues that are generated and proceeds from cap and invest programs. And all of your programs provide for investment of some of the proceeds in a variety of activities. I have a first two-part question. We'll start with Andrew. What are some of the additional greenhouse gas reduction measures that you've been able to adopt thanks to the revenue generated? And have you seen economic benefits from those investments, and what sort of an impact, and which ones have had the biggest impact?
You know, I'd say the biggest impact that we've seen is through the investment in energy efficiency. That's been by far the biggest. A smaller percentage to transportation. Even some states have incentivized the buying of electric vehicles or putting up charging stations. So that's a smaller portion of that, and then investment in renewable energy itself. And we have seen the benefits of that from sort of looking at the load in the electricity load has gone down over the period since this program began. So clearly, despite the fact that per capita GDP has gone up over that period. So we are seeing reduced demand on the grid for electricity, and through this reinvestment in the energy efficiency, I would say is the big one.
Rajinder, what's had the biggest bang for the buck for the California investments of proceeds?
Sure. Since the program began in 2012, our auctions, which are about 50% of our allowance budget for each year, we've raised about $9 billion of revenue that has gone to our greenhouse gas reduction fund. 50% of that is directly for the benefit or directly invested in disadvantaged low-income communities in the state, and that's part of state legislation. A lot of that is to make sure that there's access to clean technology. So it's solar panels on your home, weatherization projects, again, it's the demand side, and access to clean vehicles, the rebates for zero-emission vehicles. And so part of the solution is the demand side, and we are seeing reductions for energy per capita because of the demand side investment. As a cap and trade program and our command and control policies, we always go for as far upstream as we can. This is the producers of energy, the suppliers of energy, but the demand side is just as important, and you can get to that side through the revenue process, and you can direct it at populations that may not have the access or income to share in that technology. The other thing that we've seen is through investment in infrastructure. So infrastructure for zero emission vehicles, new mandates that new homes beginning in 2020 must have, or after 2020 must have solar panels, and then high-speed rail, which is, they've broken ground on it a couple years ago. Those are all creating local jobs and creating local opportunities and new professions within the state of California. We recently got a legislative request to do a report on what education programs and vocational training should look like. And all we're looking at is how do you move from traditional fossil industries like traditional refining to biofuel refining, installing infrastructure to support new green energy supply throughout the state, and to support infrastructure projects for mass transit. And those are good jobs, and they're available sooner than later, and they will get us long-term dividends in terms of greenhouse gases and public health benefits for criterion toxic pollutants.
Elizabeth, you've already touched a little bit on it, proceeds, but what other investments have been successful?
So, like I said, the cap and trade will be bringing in by 2020 4 billion Canadian dollars into our economy, and our Green Fund funds a number of measures to help reductions. So we have an energy policy, we have a sustainable mobility policy, and of course, and very importantly, we have a transportation electrification plan, because 43% of our greenhouse gas emissions comes from this sector. So our transportation electrification plan is very ambitious. It aims at getting 100,000 electric cars on our roads by 2020. In last October, we were at 37,000 cars. But overall in Canada, we're close to 80,000 electric cars overall in Canada. 37,000 come from Quebec, and Quebec's weight in Canada is only 23%. So we're almost at 50% EV cars in Quebec, with 23% of the population there. And we have the biggest charging network as well. Another program we've been able to put in place is to help developing countries to attain greenhouse gas reductions as well. So we contribute to the French-speaking countries, Sub-Saharan, North Africa, and the Caribbean through technology transfer and capacity building. Now, we were talking about the economic benefits of the cap and trade. So, of course, when we started to put together this thing, we had everybody telling us that, okay, you put in the cap and trade, companies will be leaving Quebec to go and establish themselves somewhere else. We've heard that very much. So we're now in our fifth year of the cap and trade, and we started with 80 entities being under the cap and trade. We're now at 150, which represent 85% of Quebec's greenhouse gas emitters. And our economy has never been as strong. In fact, it grew 3.1% in 2017, which was its strongest showing since 2000. And we have many companies that are coming out from our cap and trade, and we have no evidence that any of the companies have left Quebec to go to a jurisdiction where there wasn't a cap and trade. So, and when you look at it, the cap and trade, when you're talking about a business, is a very small percentage of the overall cost when you're talking labor costs, heating costs, and a number of other factors. So, and when we're talking about the economic benefit, when we're talking about our green fund that's investing in technologies, developing technologies, we have the Lion Electric company, which is a company which developed an E-Lion electric school bus. So in Quebec, in the winter, when it's minus 40 and you're going to a school, you look at the buses in the yard and you look at all, they have to keep their motors running because, of course, it's freezing and we want the kids to be warm in the buses. But the pollution around the school is terrible. So we've developed a technology that's healthier for our kids and our drivers and the people close to the schools. But not only that, it's now opening a service center in Sacramento. So we're creating jobs in Quebec with this program, but we're also creating jobs in California, which is our partner. And we have, you know, in Long Beach, we've got a company who's starting to install itself, will be implementing itself in Long Beach Port. So we're creating jobs in Quebec with this, but we're also creating jobs in California. So when we're talking economic benefits, I think that we're reducing everywhere, and the technologies developed at home can be marketed. Rio Tinto just developed the technology which they're developing aluminum, which eliminates the carbon dioxide from its smeltering process. I mean, that's a breakthrough. I mean, aluminum is everywhere in what we touch, the cars, the aluminum paper, and everything. So I think that those kind of technologies developed with the help of the green funds make it that slowly we're getting the caps down, getting our greenhouse gas down, but our economies are spurring.
Thank you for that. Another point?
I was just going to add that if you're interested, you can Google Reggie Analysis Group. They just came out with a report in the last few months that shows that the overall benefit since the beginning of the Reggie program, the overall economic benefit is over $4 billion. And that's coming from the reinvestment of proceeds. It's also coming from, you know, where is that money that folks aren't spending on electricity going? So all of those factors are actually building up to create more economic growth than even the proceeds themselves, which we just hit $3 billion in our proceeds, actually. So,
Regina, any final thoughts on this topic?
This question of proceeds and the benefits is also a political question back at home. And so you can imagine that appropriations of these funds are a joint decision as part of the budgeting process between our legislature and our governor's office. And what we frequently do is look at districts or look at regions so that our elected officials can see what the benefits are in terms of jobs and investment of the funds. And so if you're interested, you can go to our web pages for California Climate Investments and see those reports by region in the state and by projects, and the types of money and the specific projects that are being funded through the program. The one thing that I would say about the technology and all of the spurring of businesses that Elizabeth talked about is, it's true. The cap and trade program, because it creates a need for clean technology, there is additional research and development that goes on in California to try and get that kind of technology scaled up, and then out and deployed. And there is funding available through the cap and trade program to fund that research and deployment, those pilot projects in the state. And once you get over market barriers or market hurdles for that technology, anyone else that comes in after us that wants to also have that available in their jurisdictions, you don't have to go through the pain of that initial investment in research and deployment. You get to benefit from the mass production that is now in place and the easier availability of that technology. So you're absolutely right. It does create the signals in state and in certain jurisdictions, but it also makes it better for propagating climate policies elsewhere.
Great. Well, what I'd like to do now is ask the panel one more question, and then we'll go to the audience. So everybody think about your questions for when I go to you and have them ready. But I wanted to double back, and we've sort of alluded to this in passing in a couple places on how to use the proceeds and costs for families and things like that, because stakeholders always raise equity issues around these types of programs, and that includes impacts on vulnerable communities, on low-income communities, both urban and rural. Really, there are sort of there are issues in both those areas that come up and that designers of these programs need to address. And so I'd like to maybe start with Andrew this time, and if you could address how equity issues have been looked at in RGGI and what approaches have been taken.
It's interesting you're bringing this up now because we were just approached by the RGGI project series. They're going to be doing their next analysis around equity analysis. So they're going to be talking to each of the 9 states about their programs. And as you can imagine, this can be sensitive. And one of the things that the RGGI project series has said, they don't want to turn this into a metric of who's doing better than than someone else, sort of ranking or anything like that. What they want to do, and I think what we need to understand is that addressing climate change and cap and trade is not out of alignment with helping sort of these poor communities and the low-income communities. It shouldn't be seen as being out of alignment, and if you get sort of the things like the investments correct, then they can be very properly aligned. So we have a number of states that are doing things directly with subsidizing electricity bills. Other states aren't doing that, but they're making other investments in areas that that can also help. So each of the 9 states is doing something, and coming out of this this project series, which is I think going to be released in mid-year, it'll be a thorough analysis of what are states doing, what's interesting, what's working, and how we can move this forward and show that there isn't a tension, but actually an alignment between addressing climate change and helping out these lower income communities.
Elizabeth.
Okay, so Quebec has a population of 8 million people. 3.5 million live close to Montreal, and a little less than 1 million live close to Quebec City. So that means that the rest of our land is a major rural area. So given that reality, when we design the policies, particularly dealing with something as encompassing as the effects of climate change, we design policies that work both for urban and rural communities, as well as our First Nations across Quebec. So Quebec funds a number of programs and initiatives in rural Quebec, such as the regional public transportation programs. We have EV infrastructures in rural regions, bikes and cycling paths, of course, and infrastructure to encourage active mobility. Those are the programs that are very distant in our rural areas. Now, you spoke also about the impacts on energy-intensive trade-exposed industries. Well, when we designed the cap and trade the first time, we did give free allowances to make sure that these industries would be able to follow the path, and we gave them free units, and they had to buy some units as well. But the companies were encouraged to develop technologies that they would reduce their greenhouse gas, and that the units that they did purchase, they could use to resell on the market or do whatever they wish with it. But these energy-intensive industries all know that they have to get to par, and that's what they're doing right now. Rio Tinto, like I gave the example, clearly knows and is developing technologies that they will be licensing. That's what they've said. We've developed technology that we will be licensing. So it's another income revenue for them when they do this. So the cap and trade is really around.
equity has been a big issue for forever, and environmental justice and related issues in California. Regina, I'm curious to hear what approaches you've found the most successful.
Sure, and here it's important to recognize that local air quality permitting and local air quality monitoring are done by our local air quality districts, and these are regional air quality organizations. And so ARB has traditionally had primary control over mobile sources, oversight of the local air districts, but the local air districts are really the ones permitting for criterion toxics at refineries, cement plants, dry cleaners, et cetera. And what has happened over the last probably 4 or 5 decades is that low-income communities, disadvantaged communities located near these sources feel like their local air districts may have not done everything possible to protect them from criterion toxic pollutants. And so there's been a long-standing ask and a long-standing concern that more be done at the local level. When we started to do climate change at the state level in 2006, there was a fear that now that the state was going to add climate onto its mobile sources, the historical issues at the local level would not be addressed to the level that they needed to be addressed. And so as we started to embark on the climate change portfolio, not only did we try to leverage some of our programs that get public health benefits for criterion toxics, what we started to look more about individual designs of our programs and how they can maximize the co-benefits for the public health. Well, we tried that. There's very limited authority that we had at the local level, and when AB 398 was being discussed in 2017, a companion bill was passed with it, and it was AB 617. AB 617 was meant to directly address those equity issues and local air quality criterion toxics concerns that people felt were not being addressed appropriately at the local level. The state now has the authority, we ARB now have the authority to go in and help develop community monitoring plans and action plans to reduce exposure for those communities to the sources that are located within those communities. We've chosen 10 pilot communities. That process is going to kick off. The plans are being developed right now. So first it was, let's figure out what to do with the historical concerns that have been out there on local air quality, and it meant a slight change in how we have authority in going back and dealing with that. The other part about it is the investment side. So like I said, there's statutory requirements that say that we have to invest about 50% of the auction proceeds to either directly benefit or indirectly benefit low-income households in the state of California. It's a significant amount that is going back to recognize that some of these households don't have the resources to be able to go buy a new electric vehicle or resources to put solar panels on their roof. And so there are a lot of examples. I think there's been about 100,000 projects that are listed on our website where there have been investments in very specific communities, very specific project types to help low-income households have access to these kinds of tools. The other issue on equity then comes back to rural versus urban. We have a tool called CalEnviroScreen. It's not developed by ARB, it's actually held by Cal EPA, our umbrella agency, and it identifies a majority of the low-income households to be in urban areas. The question was, what about rural areas and rural communities? We worked with the local agencies in those rural communities, some of the elected officials in those local communities, and there are funds to supply new clean technology in those communities themselves. One of the recent things that we just started working on was wood stoves. So a lot of these homes in rural communities have wood stoves. They're older, they have particulate matter, they're not very safe, they're inefficient, and we are actually helping to fund installation of new wood stoves in some of the communities that are rural within the state of California. Again, the infrastructure with the utilities, we're working with the utilities to make sure that not only are they making progress in electrifying in the urban areas, but also the rural areas. And the auction proceeds, not those directly, but the value of the allowances that they get is meant to help them fund some of those activities on infrastructure. And our low carbon fuel standard was recently restructured so that if you are building infrastructure for EVs as a utility, you also get credits for some of the EV infrastructure, not just the deployment of the vehicles themselves. And so there are a variety of programs that work together, and there are specific pots of money that are available to get at some of these longstanding issues. And we had to make a change on some of our statutory authority to make sure that we were paying the attention and giving all of the effort that we needed to on the local and equity issues that we were hearing about.
Elizabeth's response reminded me that I had meant to ask about trade-exposed industry, it perhaps less relevant for Reggie, where the industries are not directly covered, although electricity prices obviously affect trade-exposed industry as well. But for both for California and Reggie, how have those issues been addressed? Maybe Andrew first.
Yeah, so certain states do set aside allowances for utilities that are seen under a certain burden, and they set aside those and basically donate or allocate those allowances to those utilities. So that's, I think, the closest we come to sort of addressing that issue, is having them, some states doing that sort of thing.
So for both California and Quebec, we auction a portion of our annual allowances. The rest of it is part of the free allocation to industry so that we protect them against leakage. And AB 32, our legislation actually says minimize emissions leakage. And that is the issue where production may leave the state in response to a cap and trade program. Emissions look like they're going down in the state, but all you've done is relocate the emissions to outside your physical boundary, and they're no longer accounted for, but the atmosphere continues to feel those. And so we have mechanisms by which we look at industry as being high, medium, and low risk for leakage, and it can be based on national or international data. I'll use our cement industry in California. They are very high leakage risk. We get lots of imports from China. We see it in the historical data. We see it in response to when we had high electricity prices and the energy crisis in the early 2000s. And so you're looking at this an analytical process to understand what category of risk your industry is at, and then setting an appropriate amount of allowances to that industry. Right now, I think we're allocating anywhere between 70 to about 85% of what the sectors need. This is manufacturing, not refineries, but manufacturing of what they need. The rest, they have to go out and they have to either reduce their emissions or actually go find allowances in the marketplace. Every year, the amount of allowances that industry gets is reduced by how the overall cap declines, and right now the cap is declining about 2% each year. Starting in 2021, the cap starts to decline at about 4% each year. So there is another built-in mechanism to reduce the amount that industry is going to get, and it's a long-term signal, so they know that they need to start planning for those drastic drops in free allocation. Another feature that we both have is output-based allocation. And what that means is the more efficient you are in your sector relative to somebody else in the sector, you get slightly more allowances. So even if you're both cement manufacturing, the cement manufacturing plant that is more efficient will get a little bit more allowances relative to their counterpart, because we wanted to reward efficiency upgrades within the manufacturing side.
Okay, we'd like to open things up now for some questions from the audience. I think we have students with microphones who can bring them to you. Who has a question? Yes. Maybe if questioners could stand and identify themselves and their organization.
I think I got it. I'm Melissa Powers. I'm a law professor at Lewis and Clark Law School. Thank you. This was very informative. My question for each of you is, if you could identify one or two either mistakes that were made early on and corrected, or just policy leapfrogs that you might recommend for future states that are either joining one of your programs or adopting their own cap and trade program, what would it be?
I can start. I think that I can't identify what we shouldn't have done. Maybe Rajinder, you can do that. But I know that how we passed it. I mean, what we did is the minute we put down the bill to set the cap and trade, we started a conversation with all the emitters, everybody who would be impacted in one way or another, to make sure that they understood how it would work, what their obligations were, what the government's obligations was, and how it would impact them in the long run, and how they can plan for it. And I think that that's really one of the secrets, that everybody has to be on board. Now, when I'm looking at other jurisdictions who are coming in, When we started to do the cap and trade, it was relatively new, to say the least. And it was scary because we didn't know how this thing would all fall down and how it would continue to go. But now that we know how it's going, we know the solidity of the market, and we know what impacts it, it's great for other jurisdictions who want to come in because they can see how we went about doing our implementations. So I think that those are the two major events or things that I think that are important when you want to do a cap and trade, is to make sure that when you launch it, you don't have 100,000 people in the street saying, no, we don't want this. So if everybody's on board, they understood it, then you can be sure that when they're not going to say, yes, we're so happy, but everybody understands that we have to move right now. There are not that many solutions that are offered. If we don't go to cap and trade, if we don't do something, what do? We wait and see. So I think that right now everybody's got some kind of the Reggie's there. There are other mechanisms that work. So I think that to implement it, I think that there are a couple of examples to go with.
Yeah, so I'd say I could get in trouble for talking about the mistakes that Reggie has made. I don't think there have been. I would say the one thing that we might have done in the beginning was be more ambitious in terms of the cap. The cap was set way too high at the beginning of the program, and it resulted in years of the price being at the floor. I would say it's a great thing to have a floor price because I think that kept the program going during those years when the price was at the floor. And then we developed a mechanism around addressing that, and that is the bank adjustment. So if you have all these allowances out there that are in the hands of the financial sector, folks who aren't needing those for compliance obligations, how many allowances are there, and then make an adjustment for that going forward. So we did a bank adjustment I think beginning in 2014 through 2020. We're actually doing a bank adjustment of 20 million allowances a year. And then we've also announced that for the program starting in 2021 through 2025, if there are, and there certainly, almost certainly will be excess allowances at the end of 2020, we will take 1/5 of those allowances each year from 2021 to 2025. So I would just say, if anything we learned was that we may not have been thinking ambitiously enough in the beginning.
So for us, when we started developing our program, we looked at all the other programs out there to inform the design of our programs, which I think gets to your question, at the heart of your question. We looked at Reggie, we looked at the EU, we understood the issues with setting caps without having good data behind it, so we had a mandatory reporting that came up beforehand. And then a self-ratcheting mechanism. Our program has always had a self-ratcheting mechanism to address low demand for allowances, the same as Quebec, and that was part of the WCI design documents. But I think one of the things that we didn't appreciate early on was we were running so quickly to get our program designed and adopted and get the systems up and get it running that we didn't pay as much attention as we could have to the communication side of it. Like, what is a cap and trade program and what is it meant to do? So folks that aren't directly regulated would have a better idea of what the state was now embarking on. The climate credit through your utility bills, that's one connection to residents about what is going on in terms of a cap and trade program. But it wasn't really until 2016 when the question came up again about the post-2020 program, uncertainty around the post-2020 program, where we started launching a better campaign about what cap and trade is, and had to do a series of analyses to show how much of a better option it is in terms of cost effectiveness when you're trying to reduce emissions relative to standard command and control or a carbon tax or a cap and tax. And so the communications piece of why cap and trade versus something else, and having the elected officials and be able to talk about it in the detail they needed to talk about it, and having just the general public understand what they're seeing in the op-eds in the LA Times or San Francisco newspapers, that really didn't come to fruition until almost 2016. And we didn't realize early on how important that would be for the program.
I'm going to step out of my moderator role for a second and throw in my 2 cents here. I was one of the first people hired in 1990 to work on the sulfur dioxide cap and trade program at EPA, and which was a huge success, as Greg noted. I think the one thing that we've learned a lot about since then, and really from the states that have been involved in these programs, is to take a much more sophisticated view of allowances and the allowance value. That program gave 100% of the allowances for free to companies. And whereas I think now we would say, well, what percent of allowances would be needed to sort of compensate companies, or it was sort of an automatic 100%. And I think there's a lot more sophisticated view now of how to use that value of those allowances, how to compensate industry, but also how to address other needs, how to invest. And so I think that's been a pretty big development in the world of cap and trade over the years. Okay, another question. Yes.
Hi, my name is Chris Allman. I'm with the Sustainable Energy and Economy Network. And my question is mostly directed to Ms. Sahota. And I want to refer to the issue of allowances and what you talk about self-ratcheting mechanisms. I know that there's been a lot of concerns about a glut of allowances, and that this glut of allowances could cause problems, which could cause problems in meeting the emissions goals of 2030. Not to mention, there's a lot of cheap offsets out there. So, what are the organizations, well, Quebec too, thinking about in terms of internally self-ratcheting, and what can Oregon do with their own self-ratcheting to address the problems of allowances, and how we link into this?
Sure. So, our emissions have dropped faster than we anticipated. And like I was saying earlier, we've dropped to 2020 levels 4 years earlier than we expected to. And from an environmental perspective, that's the right outcome. Your economy is growing and your emissions are dropping quickly. What that means is there are some unused allowances in the system. But when you look at the program and the caps that are set out to 2030, because it is one contiguous program from this current phase through 2030, there is no overshoot of allowances. Companies can bank some allowances, but it's a very small amount. Right now, if a company were to bank allowances, you'd have to be able to invest over $200 million of capital to hold those in your accounts. And less than 1% of our companies are even within 95% of those holding limits. And so you're not seeing people hoarding them in a way that would let them continue to emit at high levels in the future. We also have, like you highlighted, the offsets, but offsets are limited in our program. They were limited to 8% in Quebec and California through 2020. Post 2020, our offset usage limits drop to 4% for the first half of the decade, and then 6%. So it's not like you have this unlimited option of buying cheap offsets to come into the program. And offsets, relative to allowances, are about 90% of the allowance price. It's not like they're 50% or 10%. They're slightly cheaper, but not that much cheaper. I alluded to this earlier. We do have a self-ratcheting mechanism that was in response to some of the issues that happened with RGGI, some of the issues that happened in the EU. That mechanism is going to be pulling out allowances before 2020 out of our system and moving them into a reserve where they can't be accessed until prices hit something like $80, which I don't think they will. Now, looking forward, we did an assessment of what our emissions are going to look like. We looked at the caps from 2021 to 2030. We looked at what the potential unused allowances could be. Like I said, there is no glut over the long time program out to 2030. There's also about half a dozen third-party analyses that show that in the middle part of next decade, we will have gone through all of the unused allowances, and that the caps will actually start to push prices above the floor. Now, when they start to rise quickly above the floor, we don't know exactly, because it also depends on where your emissions are going to be and other macroeconomic factors of growth in the economy, fuel prices, et cetera. But there is nothing that says our prices or our allowances are going to result in a collapse in the carbon price signal through 2030. And so, you know, if other programs underperform, cap and trade has to pull a higher weight, which means more demand on the program, which means higher prices. If all the measures perform as required, we have that analysis out there. It's on us to monitor the program and the emissions every year and all the complementary policies and be willing to make adjustments if necessary. It's got some self-ratcheting mechanisms in there, but if we start to see some systematic issues in the program, and whether it's cap and trade or LCFS or RPS, we're going to have to monitor and adjust those. And we've adjusted the cap and trade program, I think, 6 times already. So it's not like we're unwilling to monitor and adjust along the way. I think the analysis is posted to our website. It's Appendix D to our rulemaking for this rulemaking for 2017. I would direct any questions about the analysis on oversupply there, because that question came up several times. I think it started in 2016, and it was really a hook to try and angle for a different program in California. So there's a history behind why that issue keeps coming up, even though we've debunked the math behind it and shown that it's not an issue. And it's because we had some voices in California that really wanted to not move forward with cap and trade and move forward with something like a higher priced carbon tax with about $60 in 2021. But then on the other side, we have the oil companies that'll say it's expensive at any price, and we're going to be at $100 in the next decade, and we need to have more allowances in the system. So you've got analyses and you've got opinions on both sides, and we're right in the middle right now, which is probably a good place for a regulator.
Yes.
My name is Erin Yoderlog. I'm a 2L at the University of Oregon. I'm very interested in energy law and understanding exactly how cap and trade works. You mentioned earlier the importance of being able to link up with other markets, and that a market is only as strong as its weakest links. So I'm wondering how a big utility company like PG&E filing for bankruptcy in California affects the market. And then the second part to that question is, if it does negatively affect the market, how does that affect states like Oregon and their ability to link up with the market?
Sure. PG&E filing for bankruptcy doesn't mean we're not going to get power, or power isn't going to be generated and emissions aren't going to happen. For us in California, they're looking at selling their gas assets right now, and there is a market for gas. All of us have gas boilers right now because electric boilers aren't that prevalent. So from an emissions perspective, which is demand in the market, we don't think it's going to change. What's probably going to change is who's responsible for those emissions in the market. And I think who pays for those emissions and who's responsible for those are independent of the performance of the market and its stringency and ability to be linkable. It's like any other corporate takeover. Marathon came in and took over one of our big refineries. It didn't mean that it was an issue for the linked market. It just meant somebody else was going to be responsible for surrendering those allowances against those emissions.
So I want to take one more question, if there's one out there, and then I want to go back to the panel for sort of a final word to wrap things up. Any final questions? Yes.
Hi, I'm Chris Wold at Lewis and Clark Law School. My question relates to the administrative costs of implementing a program like this. We always hear that these market instruments are great for businesses because they can choose the most efficient way to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions in this case. But what does that mean at the agency level? I'm hearing from all of you that significant work is happening within your agencies to make sure the accounts are handled correctly, that the program is implemented correctly. So maybe you could explain what the administrative costs have been for your agencies and how that might compare to a more traditional command and control based system. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd just say for Reggie, what I can say is that over the history of between the states and Reggie Inc., it's been about 4 to 5% of the overall proceeds that have gone back to pay for the administration of the program. So that's sort of the order of magnitude of the cost of the program. And with $3 billion in proceeds, so something like, what is that, $15 million to run the program over that period.
So for California and Quebec, the jurisdictions retain all policymaking, oversight, and enforcement of the program, but the administration of the program is done at WCI Inc., and it's a slightly different model than Reggie. They're very much more administrative. They handle the systems, the contracts, all of those aspects. And so we pay into WCI Inc. in addition to having our own staff within the agency. So for us, if we had pursued any other program like direct command and control, we probably would have still needed those same resources within the agency to be able to administer those new climate programs or an alternative to cap and trade. The additional cost is really shared between California and Quebec, and it's based on size in the market. So it's not like Quebec is funding 50%. I think you're about 15% of the linked market in terms of emission size. So California pays about 86% of the cost for WCI Inc., and Quebec pays the remaining share. When Ontario was in, they paid a portion of that, which reduced it for both of us. But in terms of the infrastructure and the ability for linkage, it does really allow you to pool those resources. You get to hire one market monitor, share the cost for it, that looks over 3 different programs. You get to have one trading system with one contractor for software that you're sharing the cost with other jurisdictions. For us, it's a very small percentage as well of the overall $9 billion, relative to the $9 billion that we've raised. I can't remember the number, but I think our annual payment into WCI Inc. is maybe $2 million. But I'd have to go back and look at that. But it's a very small percent overall of the proceeds relative to the proceeds that we have from the program.
And in Quebec, with the WCI, Originder just explained that. But in Quebec, we have, of course, the public servants who are responsible of the program in our ministry. But those public servants were working on the pollution areas, so they were just specialized into our cap and trade team. So for us, that was an equivalent. And like Reginder says, the amount of money that I don't have it in mind, but I know it's minimal compared to the $4 billion that we're getting from the cap and trade.
Okay, I want to have a final lightning round and close with this. And just ask, and maybe just go down the line, starting with Reginder, what advice you would give, or what take-home message, if you had to pick one thing to give to other jurisdictions that are thinking about cap and trade, or to Oregon in specific.
Learn from all the people that have come before you, but know that you're probably going to have to make adjustments to your own programs. None of us got it right the first time, even though we thought we had the best theories and the best academics and the best experts informing it and the smartest staff. And it's okay to not get it right the first time, but be willing to make those adjustments and be open to making those adjustments. Obviously, we support any action on climate change. We found that cap and trade was the most cost effective. Our industry supported it overwhelmingly when we went to our legislature 2 years ago. So, it's the right thing for California. It could be the right thing for Oregon. We respect that it's an internal discussion in Oregon, but really it's good to learn from everyone that came before you.
Okay, I would just say that, when I think about the program, the RGGI program over the decade that it's been implemented and all the changes we've seen both economically and politically, that this program has stayed the course. As someone once said, if you want to achieve transformation, you have to have constancy of purpose, and I think RGGI has provided that constancy of purpose, at least in the utility sector. So if Oregon is interested in addressing the transformation required to address climate change, thinking about a program where you can be a part of that constancy, I think is very, very important.
I would say that, I said it before, I think that the importance is the communications part. If you don't get the communications part out of it right, you've got a problem. And for Quebec, we talked a little earlier about the acid rain problem, and in the 1980s, I still remember how that issue was so enormous in Quebec. We have a wood industry that's so important, and when we were talking about acid rain, in those years, you'd think that they were burning the trees right down at that time. And we're very fortunate in Quebec from being sensibilisé, informed of this situation in those years, because now when we did pass our cap and trade law, all the MNAs of our elected officials in Quebec voted for the cap and trade. When we passed the zero emission standard law, all the elected officials voted on board with it. So when we're talking communication, it's great because in Quebec, the population is on board and our politicians are also the ones who are talking about it, and that's really helping us.
Please join me in thanking this wonderful panel. And we are going to take about a 10-minute break, come back here at 10 after the hour for the second panel.
All right, I think, did you mute it?
I did not mute it.
Okay.
Let me see.
There it is. Okay, there we go.
So somehow the blank got pushed.
The what got pushed?
This blank button.
Interesting.
Or maybe
Okay.
it times out.
Okay.
Maybe it times out.
Okay. All right.
So I'm getting some photos where I'm sitting. Any word back from her coming back?
I sent you what she sent to me. She's in the meeting. Yeah, I figured that the student would be a little bit more like what we've dealt with in the school.
Yeah, I mean, at least it's fine if they leave, but every segment has to have a series of photos taken.
Good morning. Welcome back from break. I think we're about ready to get started. If you could take your seats, please. Good morning. My name is Amber Lesher, and I'm a second-year law student at the University of Oregon, and I'm also a staff editor on the Journal of Environmental Law and Litigation. I hope you enjoyed the first panel as much as I did. I would like to take a moment to welcome our next distinguished panelists. We have great climate leaders here in Oregon, and we're very fortunate that they're taking time to be with us this morning. Senator Michael Dembrow and Representative Karin Power are the co-chairs of the Joint Committee on Carbon Reduction. Senator Dembrow represents District 23 on the east side of Portland. Representative Power represents District 41 in Milwaukee, Oregon. Together, they will lead the Carbon Reduction Committee as it considers climate legislation in the upcoming session. We're also very happy to have Kristen Sheeran of Governor Kate Brown's office and the Carbon Policy Office join us this morning. Her work and expertise is helping to ensure that the governor and legislature are working together on the same page. For more information on our panelists, I encourage you to review their bios in your programs. Thank you, Professor Dotson, for moderating this panel. With no further ado, here is our 2019 legislative session panel.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you. Let's welcome our leaders. Thank you, Amber. I'm Greg Dotson again with the University of Oregon School of Law, and I was so excited to see all the conversations happening during the break. You'll be able to continue those after this panel over lunch. On the last panel, we learned a bit about what's been happening in California, in the northeastern states, in Quebec, and I think that's going to provide some important context for what Oregon is thinking about doing. That's what we're going to be exploring on this panel. So we're so happy to have Senator Dembrow, Representative Power, and Kristen Sheeran with us this morning. They are the key leaders, as Amber mentioned, and I want to thank you all for being here. I'm going to kick off the conversation in a moment. I want everyone to know that we will save some time for questions for the audience at the end. So be thinking about those as we get started. So I'd like to start off with a question for each of you, which is, why are we focused on climate change now? What has captured the attention of the legislature and the governor and convinced them that now is the time to act?
Well, I almost feel like I don't need to answer that. The answer is self-evident. But certainly we've already heard references to the fires that have been affecting us recently. We hear about fire, about the different weather events, from our constituents. We've heard, we've just received the updated National Climate Assessment. We got the recent devastating report from the IPCC. We have seen further evidence, how shall I put this diplomatically, that change is not going to come at the federal level anytime soon, right? We had an election this year in which a lot of new people were elected to the Oregon legislature, and all of them ran with climate action as one of their major planks. And they did that. It was no accident. That's what they were hearing from their constituents, that this was a foremost concern, and they would vote for candidates who would support far-reaching climate action. I think, finally, I'll say, and these are all reasons that I'm really optimistic that in the next few months we will be able to shepherd this bill to success here in Oregon this year, and join California and Quebec and entice our neighbors to the north and to other parts of the state of the country to join us. We had a clear commitment this year from the governor and from the presiding officers of our chambers, who jointly co-chaired the committee that Karin and I are now inheriting. We were the co-vice chairs, and the Speaker of the House and the Senate President were the chairs of the committee, because they were extremely serious about us moving forward. They were committed to us moving forward and working with the governor. And I just have to say, for those of you who are not insiders to the process, this kind of alignment between the governor, the speaker, the president is incredibly rare. And it's there because of the enormity of the challenges that we face. So.
Before I get started, I want to give a couple thank yous to people in this room, because I'm the newest co-chair to this, and this will be my first committee that I'm chairing, have the pleasure and honor of chairing. First, we wouldn't have gotten this far without Representative Ken Helm working with Michael Dembro on this, so I want to give him a round of applause. Representative Helm is also the chair of our Energy and Environment Committee, so I'm grateful to him to giving me a venue to help the team with this effort, so we can spread out our workload a little bit more. He has a lot of important environmental work in his committee ahead in the upcoming session. And then I want to thank Beth Riley, who's our committee administrator in the back. Beth is our nonpartisan staff who staffs this committee. And so for any of you who are calling about how to submit citizen input, who are sending along information to submit into our record, you will be getting Beth, and Beth helps organize all of our work and all of our speakers. It's a huge amount of work and is really important to keeping us going.
And she will arbitrate all our disputes, right, Beth?
Perfect. I think, echoing what Senator Dembro said, I grew up in New Jersey, and my parents still live there, so they lived through Hurricane Sandy. And all the places that I grew up in and liked to hang out and got absolutely hammered by that superstorm. When my dad called and said, "I heard that your state capital doesn't have drinking water," that kind of elevates it. I mean, we've seen the smoke, but to have people have to go out and purchase water for weeks without knowing when they're going to be able to access sort of those basic necessities that government's supposed to provide, I think that was sort of the capstone this summer on a call to doing this work. And I would never wish that problem on any of our local jurisdictions, but it also happened to be the local jurisdiction that our Senate president resides in. So it just, I think the evidence has been stacking up for quite some time in Oregon. This summer it became absolutely undeniable that we needed to take action this year.
Anything you'd like to say on the governor's behalf, Kristen?
Sure. I think just echoing on the comments that have already been shared. I mean, the governor views climate change as as perhaps the single most important threat facing Oregon. It threatens our communities, it threatens our economy, it threatens our way of life here in Oregon. So there is no single, larger challenge or set of opportunities to address right now. And as the leader of Oregon charged with safeguarding the future of our state, there's nothing more important right now than making sure that our state continues to proactively address the climate crisis. And to do so, and I'm sure we'll talk about this today, but to do so in a way that hopefully sets a model for other states and jurisdictions to do as well.
Thank you. Let's move on and talk about the process. I think if this were an action movie, we would be at the point where the big car chase is about to start. I think, Senator Dimbro, the last time we had you here was an event in October of 2017, and Representative Helm joined us as well. And at that time, both of you talked about how you're going to be embarking on a process to really engage stakeholders, commit working groups on various topics, and figure out how such a policy might affect the state. Can you tell us what's happened in the intervening time, and how have the efforts gone? What kind of foundation have you built for action?
Yeah, boy, that seems like a decade ago, doesn't it? One of our goals has been to, as I sort of alluded to before, to create a program that can be a model for other states to follow. But another one of our goals was to go through the process of creating the program in a way that other states could also emulate. That is, to have it be very open, very participatory, very thorough, very engaging. And be careful what you wish for, because it has been nonstop, frankly, since then. We created 4 working groups, one on environmental justice, just transition, one on working lands, thank you, Representative Helm, one on transportation and utilities, and one on regulated entities. And had just hearing after hearing, I think we generated thousands of pages of public testimony, hours of archived testimony. Only Beth Riley can say just how extensive it is. There are many doctoral dissertations in our computer system that people can use. And it led us to develop the proposals that came out in the short February legislative session. We had a Senate version, a House version, slight differences, largely the same. Rep. Helms and my committee met jointly to discuss them and to have public hearings on them. I will say, even before the session started, we knew that we were not going to get the legislation over the finish line in that short session. Short sessions are really hard to get a really complicated piece of legislation through, even one that had as much public work over the previous couple of years. So we knew that, and although most people didn't know that, we were already working on a bill that was called Plan B. That was a joke. We were already working on Plan B, which was, is there a way that we can, even if we can't pass the bill this session, do work and sort of create a platform so that we would still be on schedule to meet our original goal of having a program that would be ready to go in 2021, but just have a lot of the work that would have had to happen during rulemaking after we passed it, different studies, different refinements, et cetera, and use the intervening months to have those reports done, to make those decisions so that we can incorporate them into the actual bill, the findings, and thus have our colleagues be voting on a bill where more was known. And that was kind of the silver lining. To do that, of course, we had to set money aside. We had to trust the governor to spend that money wisely. which she has done, I'm happy to say. Created the Carbon Office, the Governor's Carbon Office, headed by Kristen Sheeran, that oversaw the different studies and did the work and helped us with the further drafting of the legislation. We also created the Joint Committee on Carbon Reduction, with, as I'd alluded to, chaired by our presiding officers. But, I will say also, Karin and I were the co-vice chairs, but we also had Republican colleagues as co-vice chairs, because our goal here is, we're hoping that the vote on this bill can be bipartisan. But if it can't be, and there are many political reasons that kind of militate against that, even if it can't be, at least we have done this in a way that we really were engaging both parties, people from all over the state, taking the interest and making it a better bill because those perspectives were right at the heart of the discussions. And I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Karin, and especially in the latter part.
Well, I think that brings us to where we are today. And I don't mean to jump ahead unless you have part of the process. But for me, throughout the fall, we got some pretty meaty reports. If you feel like going back to the record, there's probably dozens and dozens and dozens of pages of great information you can wade through on a variety of different sectors. For me, some touch points along the process. Though we didn't get the bill out of our committee into the floor in both chambers for a vote earlier this year, we had the largest lobby day, Citizens Climate lobby day that I've ever seen, probably in the history of the state. And it was truly overwhelming to see how many people showed up on this issue. And this is a priority for us because of the amount of people who continue to show up on the issue. There is going to be an enormous amount of work on other subject matter areas in the upcoming session. And for those of you who perhaps followed the governor's inaugural address earlier this week, she laid out the sort of landscape of work ahead of us, and it's huge. But this is right at the top of the pile because of the amount of people who've said, we need to take action now. This is a voting issue for me and for my family, and the people who continue to make that trek hours to Salem every single time we've had a committee. So thank you. I know some of you are in this room. Pivoting to some of the vice chairs meeting, and I think just teeing us up for where we are right now, it's good to keep in mind that part of our process is driven by our schedules. And as part-time citizen legislators, we have other work schedules that have sort of dictated how frequently the vice chairs have been able to get together, and other work that's called us out of the country. So we've had a great series of meetings this fall leading through the holiday season. But there's a lot of issues to get through, and for the first time, my Republican colleagues are at times for the first time really taking a hard look at this. And you've got Cliff Spence, who's an attorney. I am as well, so it's been fun for, I think, Senator Dembrow to sit in the meetings with us.
I think we all know how much fun it is spending time with lawyers, so. So that does bring us to where we are, and we have not yet seen a legislative proposal. It hasn't been released yet. And so Representative Power, Senator Dembrow, I don't know if you could tell us when we should expect to see that legislation, and sort of what are the outstanding or unanswered questions? What's the process you see going forward?
So we just started this week. We were sworn in on Monday. We've been at an organizational days. It took me about 3 days to catch a cold from one of my colleagues, so if I'm sniffling through this, it's the great thing about being 90 of us from all over the state. So this past year, we moved up our legislative calendar for the first time ever. We are going to sine die on or before June 30th of this year, and we've done that in part because July 4th and activities and being out, with family is really important to our colleagues. And in previous years, we weren't sure when we were going to be done. Our end date was always kind of floating. And in 2017, I think the Senate worked through the 4th of July holiday, which nobody was a fan of. So we've moved our entire legislative calendar up by 2 weeks this year for the first time, without realizing that holidays don't change just because our work starts earlier. So we don't yet have a bill ready in the public arena that's been run through our attorneys, done final edits on, and published. But we are not alone. I was speaking with some of my colleagues. They too are a little behind in getting drafts back from our attorneys working on these issues because they all took vacation, as they should have. And we are, as I think you and I both hold constituent coffees every month. I've had a couple constituents who have been really concerned that we don't have a bill yet. And so I've been trying to reassure them that it is, frankly, a workload issue rather than anything else.
So I'll be a little more explicit. You know, Karen's a lawyer, so she'll never say anything, but I'm the blabber. You know, the speaker made a promise that we'd have a bill by the end of the month, and we will have a bill for you by the end of the month. That may be mere hours before the end of the month, but we are scheduled right now for the day after. Actually, let me back up. The Joint Committee is scheduled to meet twice each week, Monday evenings and Friday afternoons. What did we do to deserve that? But the advantage of it, frankly, is it makes it easier to do public testimony. You know, when we have an evening hearing, in this case Monday, and then Friday tends to be, for a lot of people, easier days for them to travel, take time off and travel down to Salem. So that's when our meeting, our committee will meet. We'll have our first meeting, not the first Monday, because the session doesn't start till Tuesday, because Monday is Martin Luther King Jr. holiday. We'll have our first meeting on on Friday, and then the plan is that on Friday, the following Friday the 1st, we will have the bill in hand, and Legislative Council will walk us through it. So that's what you want to watch out for. And of course, as I think probably a lot of people in this room know, you don't have to come to Salem to see the presentation or to see the bill. Everything is posted online. The meetings are live streamed, they're archived, so there will be a lot of resources there for you. We will then follow with, we'll have a number of reports. We'll be hearing from the Global Warming Commission and from the Oregon Climate Change Research Institute, two entities that the legislature created more than a decade ago to help keep us abreast of issues related to climate change. And they will come before us on our very first meeting. And actually, that schedule has just been posted, I think, mere minutes ago. Beth is nodding, yes. It's great having Beth sitting next to me there at the table. Right? So you can go and see the agenda. So that, you know, kind of in a nutshell is what we're looking at. We'll have, you know, some of our public testimony will come in the form of invited testimony. We'll be honored to have a panel of tribal leaders coming and speaking to us. They'll be one of the earliest reactors to what we're doing. But we'll also hear from people and organizations on different sides of the issues that will come up in the bill. They will be invited to give their perspective. And then we'll have 2-3 sessions of, you know, for the general public to come and share their thoughts with us. And of course, even as that's happening, even as that bill comes out sometime before the end of the month, the amendment process will have begun. Do not believe that what comes out that day will be the final version. There will be amendments to, you know, certainly technical things. If there are things in it that, you know, that we got wrong, those have to be fixed. But then also there will be some policy decisions that we'll be doing a lot of talking about among ourselves and with a whole host of stakeholders.
Great, thank you. Kristen, A few moments ago, Senator Dimbro said it's pretty uncommon to have the governor and the legislature working together in the way that they are. And
No. We do a lot. We work together a lot.
Well, I certainly think it's a good sign that the three of you are sitting here together talking about this. But I just want to ask you to sort of describe the relationship, the working relationship that's happening between the branches on this issue, both as it's been to date and going forward.
Sure. I'd probably be remiss if I didn't, while this is a very rare, degree of alignment and I think commitment to the goals of the program and to addressing climate in Oregon between the leadership of the two chambers and the governor. Oregon's recent legislative history, though, and I'm looking specifically at our transportation package that was passed in 2017, I think is a really good indicator of how when you have that alignment between the governor's office and the leadership of the legislative branches, when you have bipartisan interest and collaboration around a difficult issue, you can get to really constructive solutions in ways that really begin to chart a different course for the state. And so I think we're looking to build on that kind of record of success, and we've been doing so. So since the legislature convened at the end of last session and they created the Carbon Policy Office, through the executive branch, we've been off and running, doing the work to continue to sort of fill in the meat on the bones of the basic cap and trade framework, particularly with an eye to implementation of the program by 2021. And what that's meant is we've been actively engaged in conversations with stakeholders, all those entities who are directly or indirectly implicated in a program such as this, to really understand their hopes, their expectations, their opportunities, and their concerns, and how do we incorporate that in the design of the program and implementation. There were some very specific research questions that the legislature asked us to go out and find some answers to, and so we've convened studies both, sometimes internally with our state agencies or externally with consultants. And then we've been reaching out and working and learning from our colleagues in California and Quebec, in the RGGI states, and in other places around the world, so that we understand what's ahead of us. We're learning from the lessons that they've already been able to experience and learn from themselves as they're further ahead of us in the implementation of these kinds of programs. So all of that work, collectively, we've shared with the legislature and working very collaboratively now to make sure that the policy that we're all eager to see in a couple of weeks' time will reflect the state's goals and ambitions, and also the priorities of the Speaker, the Senate President, and the Governor, and I'm confident it will.
Great. Before we get too much into the substance of the proposal, you're embarking on something that's a little bit different, I think, than some laws, in that you're going to be you're developing a policy that will significantly transform the state, or at least our emissions profile, and it's going to drive these changes over a period of decades. And we touched on this maybe a little bit earlier, but what's sort of the philosophy of how you're doing that? How do you think about those changes and the long-term nature of it as you work to craft the legislation?
I kind of touched on this before, that when I mentioned that the silver lining of not having passed the bill in 2018 is that it allows us to get more into the bill itself, more specificity into the bill, rather than just leave it up to the agency to develop the program. And that, I think, is making our colleagues feel better about what we're offering to them. But at the same time, and we're committed to that, but you have to find that sort of balancing point where you don't want to be overly restrictive in the legislation, so that everything, if things don't work out exactly as anticipated, or if changes need to be made, that you have to go back to the legislature, you have to wait till the next session and go through the politics of making the change. So that that's kind of what we've been struggling with. I suspect there's still a bit more struggle to go over finding that right path. We're it's flexible, but it's clear.
And I think that's particularly become important, and I'll let you speak about the authority in a second. I think that's a helpful piece to this. As we hit the home stretch on this bill, setting up a program that in statute is going to be durable for the next 30 years, when very different philosophies may be at the table, and we might have had to course correct a number of different ways to adaptively manage the program to respond to where investments need to go the most. Allowing that flexibility and that structure within this particular bill has been an important part of our conversation. And we've also touched on how do we cultivate the next generation of leadership along the way who will be running this program at some point in time in their professional lives, and gathering the sort of stakeholder support and knowledge and learning that'll happen over the next couple of years as we engage in rulemaking will be a key component of this as well.
Sure, and Representative Power referenced the implementation and the Oregon Climate Authority. So as I mentioned, the governor's been looking ahead to implementation. It's critically important we craft smart policy right out of the gate, but implementation is as important as as that initial policy, because that's literally where the rubber's going to hit the road in terms of, are we able to achieve, the outcomes that the policy has outlined. So we've been thinking about implementation, and in recognition of the, that climate isn't going, as significant as this policy will be to achieving our state's, climate goals. We know that we are in it for the long term in terms of addressing climate change as a state. This is a generational, multi-generational challenge, and so thinking ahead to the magnitude of that challenge and the opportunities, both on the mitigation and on the adaptation side, the governor has proposed the creation of a new agency called the Oregon Climate Authority that could consolidate our existing energy programs, the work of the current Carbon Policy Office, and bring that alignment of our expertise and our programming to make sure that we continue to stay ahead of the climate challenge in Oregon. That agency, we anticipate, would be the implementing authority for the cap and trade bill as it's passed, as well as continue to operate our existing clean energy programs and climate programs in the state. So the implementation piece is key, and that's a lot of the effort and time that's been spent over the last year really has been thinking about, how do we implement this program most effectively. And I guess the only other thing I would say in terms of trying to find that right balance between flexibility and what do you put in statute versus what do you leave to rules, and the rules would be handled by this new climate authority. Certainty is really important. It's not only important to the businesses and other regulated entities who are implicated in this program, who would be included under the carbon cap. But if you think about what it is we really want to accomplish, where we really want to see investments by these entities, our utilities, our manufacturers, our other industries, we want to see them making long-term investments in new technologies and new processes to drive down emissions. And we want to see long-term new investment in Oregon by clean technology and other industries who are drawn to our state because of the clean energy policy infrastructure we've put in place. And so the way you drive that investment is by creating certainty and creating the right set of market signals and incentives. And so we want the certainty on the one hand, but on the other hand, we know that, and we heard this in the previous panel, we won't necessarily get everything right out of the bat. And so we need the flexibility to be adaptive as we implement the program and be able to learn. And I think what you'll see come out in a few weeks, I think, strikes that balance really well.
Great. And since you've mentioned the Climate Governance Authority, what's the reaction been in the legislature to that proposal?
I would say a wait and see attitude. I think that it's only been really kind of mentioned. I'm not sure any of our colleagues have had a chance to really be exposed to the in-depth thinking around it. You've probably if you followed the governor's presentation of her budget when she first revealed this, The new climate authority would be taking elements from our current Department of Energy and making sure that everything is being done through a climate lens, and that will also be this sort of coordinator of a variety of climate efforts, some still being done by DEQ, some, certainly our friends at the PUC, and thank you for being here, Department of Forestry, our watershed enhancement boards, the different existing agencies that are going to be helping us implement a number of the investments coming out of this program. But the specific nature of what that agency is going to be and what its authorities will be, those are going to be coming to solidity on that is going to be one of the charges of our joint committee and the work that we'll be doing this session. I think there's a lot of excitement about this focus.
It's awesome.
Yeah.
It is. I think the details are just still forthcoming. It was an announcement that followed on the heels of her strong re-election results, and I think knowing how many of my new colleagues were elected on a climate platform, or at least a key component of their forthcoming work, the governor's leadership in this space and the leadership of her advisors is nothing short of phenomenal. I would be so thrilled to live in a state with a state agency that has climate in its name, so we can finally perhaps put that issue to rest over whether it is changing or not. But I think broader, it is good to contextualize our work on this particular bill in the larger landscape of efforts. And a lot of the existing complementary programs, much like California's, have functioned together in tandem, but live perhaps within pieces of different agencies. And Oregon has done a great job of standing up commissions in the past or funds in the past without ever adequately funding them. So I was astonished after I was elected to learn that we've had a global warming commission for more than 10 years, but have never actually funded the work that they've done. They have to borrow from other different pieces of agencies, and that's sort of what we've done to cobble together this work over a period of time. Aligning this in one location where we have clarity on the vision and accountability and a set of folks working on it in tandem, for me would be, I think, provide some additional assurance that this program is going to get off to the right start and on the right foot, but also provide the long-term leadership that we're going to need in this space.
Great. Well, let's dive into the details of the legislation. So, Kristen, I know, generally speaking, what does the governor hope to see in this legislation?
Sure. So, the governor has some very clearly articulated, priorities and goals for the legislation. She's looking to this legislation to provide a policy framework that can clearly achieve the state's emissions goals, that will continue to grow Oregon's clean energy economy, and in the process helps to prepare Oregon's communities and economies for the impacts of climate change we know are coming. So that's at the highest level. I think one of the reasons the governor is drawn to the cap and trade or cap and invest style approach to addressing our state's greenhouse gas emissions is because that cap will provide certainty, at least across the sectors that are included in the cap, that the state will stay within its carbon budget. And that certainty toward progress toward our long-term goals is something that we currently don't have, despite the success of a wide portfolio at this point of climate and clean energy programs in our state. The cap and invest type of approach also provides those market incentives and that flexibility to make sure that as we're driving forward as a state toward those emissions reduction goals, we're doing so in a way that's efficient and at the lowest possible cost. And I think that gets us to what is really critically important to the governor, and that is, as we're looking ahead to this kind of program, we have to do so in a way that ensures that while we're creating a tremendous amount of new opportunities for our state, that we do so in a way that we don't leave anybody behind. We can't leave any Oregonians behind in the creation of this program. And luckily, the experience of other jurisdictions show us how we can do that. And in this, the governor's, particularly concerned with making sure that this program works to the benefit of our tribes, of our rural communities, of our communities of color, and really all those communities that are currently right now at the forefront experiencing climate impacts. And that as we're creating new jobs, we're being mindful of protecting the existing jobs and industries that we have here in Oregon. And then lastly, I would say that it's really important to the governor that as we go down this path, that we do so in a way that is, collaborative with other jurisdictions, with an eye to our ability to link our efforts, hopefully with the Western Climate Initiative. We believe that that is, certainly that would be good for Oregon's economy to link our efforts with the broader carbon market. But we also see it as sort of, coming to fruition of the kind of partnership and collaboration that Oregon already brings to its existing climate and clean energy work, and the partnerships we've struck up and down the West Coast, and particularly through the Pacific Coast Collaborative in working with California and Washington, British Columbia, and other jurisdictions to address climate over the last 10 or 15 years. So that linkage is really important, and it's also, the governor's hoping that as Oregon steps out in this way, that other jurisdictions and other states are able to emulate our actions, and so that the momentum that we already see happening worldwide to, address carbon emissions, whether through it's a cap and trade or a carbon tax or similar type mechanisms, that momentum continues to grow. And that becomes the new norm for economies worldwide.
And Greg, if I may, so I think when you see the bill that comes out, everything that Kristen has just mentioned is kind of distilled into 4 areas of focus for the program, and those are also, if you might want to think about the investment buckets for any proceeds from the program. First of all, carbon reduction, greenhouse gas emissions reduction is one. The second is, obviously we are already feeling the effects of climate change with respect to ocean acidification, or, fragility of our forests, et cetera. We need to have adaptation strategies for those to make our communities more resilient. So adaptation resiliency is the second sort of bucket. The third, we know that there is already too much carbon in the atmosphere, and we have to get as much of it out as possible, get it sequestered and stored down here. And that's obviously, I don't need to tell you, where Oregon can really punch above its weight class, because we're so good at growing trees, but also our wetlands, our rangelands, our agriculture can also become carbon sinks that can help with that. So that's the third bucket, sequestration. And finally, the whole area of transition assistance. As Kristen mentioned, we want to make sure that the implementation of this program and the movement to a cleaner energy economy doesn't happen on the backs of our most vulnerable citizens or our companies and drive them offshore. And so transition assistance is also kind of a lens that we want to see this work through, and a focus of our investments.
Great, thank you very much. I think that's all new information. I appreciate you sharing that today. We learned a fair amount about your thinking back in December when there was a meeting of the committee, and we heard some presentations. It sounds like there's been a fair amount of agreement about how to handle the electricity sector. I was wondering if one of you could sort of describe, where we are on that and why.
Hey, Kristen.
Okay. So, obviously our electricity sector is a critical piece of the puzzle in addressing greenhouse gas emissions in Oregon. And I think the good news on the electricity front is that because of both policies that have been put in place, from our renewable portfolio standard to Senate Bill 1547, which provided a firm end date for coal being served to Oregon electricity customers, to our energy efficiency work that has really led the nation. Because of all of that, and because of the economics of clean energy right now, driving down the cost of wind and solar, of storage, and continued improvements on the efficiency front, that all of those things combined mean that and our ample hydropower base that we already have to build off of here in Oregon that is zero emissions, that all of those things combined mean we have a grid that is rapidly becoming cleaner and cleaner. So our electricity sector is already on a good course. And the challenge now is how do you drive those changes even faster? How do we drive the investments and the transition away from legacy investments? How do we drive the investments in renewables and efficiency and the transition away from legacy fossil resources like gas and coal even faster under a cap and trade program? And we're mindful that because of the existing policies that have already been put in place in the state, that our ratepayers in Oregon, they see some of those investments in their rates. And so, as was discussed, with previous jurisdictions who were up here earlier today, cap and trade gives us the flexibility through the distribution of allowances to address some of that. And so what I think we're looking at here in Oregon right now is an approach that would say, during a distribution of allowances to customers of electric utilities that reflects the investments that have already been made and that are already planned under existing laws to drive carbon out of the electricity sector. And if we do it in that way, we should avoid any duplication of costs with existing programs and policies that are already in place. So those are the kinds of conversations we've been having both with our investor-owned utilities and with our consumer-owned utilities. And we look forward to continued conversations ahead.
Great. So there's also, we heard in the last panel, a fair amount of discussion of what they call energy-intensive, trade-exposed businesses. And for those of you that aren't in the lingo, that means those companies that are price sensitive to increases in energy costs. Maybe they can't switch to clean electricity options very easily. And then if they do bear those costs, they will be subject to overseas competition in a way that, that Oregonians might be concerned about. I know this is an issue that all of you have focused on a lot. In 2018, the legislature provided some resources to the Carbon Policy Office to examine this exact issue. And I was wondering if you could give us an update on where you are on that, what we've learned and what we think we're going to do about it.
Sure, happy to. So there was a report submitted to the Joint Committee back in December. It was conducted by a research firm called Vivid Economics that we put under a contract with the Carbon Policy Office. And it was in response to the legislature's request that we go out and really better understand, which entities in Oregon that could be directly regulated under this program are at risk for potential risk for leakage under a program like this. And so the program that we're looking at in Oregon would directly implicate entities that have emissions above 25,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. There's roughly about 30 manufacturers in Oregon who are currently above that threshold. So the study started with those 30 manufacturers, and it looked at the specific economic conditions of those sectors, including extensive conversation with those manufacturing entities themselves. So it was looking at, what's the extent of your market, where do you compete globally? And as we came to discover, a lot of that competition is actually within the U.S. and other states where there isn't carbon regulation currently in place or necessarily even being contemplated. What kinds of margins do you operate on, and what's the ability to pass on a carbon cost to customers? And then what kinds of measures, are technically available to reduce emissions in your sector? How can you drive down emissions, and how many of those opportunities has the entity already availed itself of as sort of a measure of where there may be additional room to drive down emissions? And so it sort of took all of that information into account and evaluated, which of those sectors are, the term is emissions intensive, trade exposed, and those are the entities that are potentially at leakage risk, and delivered that report to the legislature along with a set of recommendations, most importantly, that says, okay, great, if these industries are potentially at leakage risk, what do you do about it, right? And what the study by these economists showed is that you still include those entities under the carbon cap. They're still included under the program because you want that long-term price signal, that price incentive to continue to drive toward more efficiency and different technologies and processes as they'll evolve over time. But what you can do is, use a distribution of allowances to help those entities comply under the cap, particularly in those early years. And you do an output-based methodology for allocating those emissions so that, you are recognizing that the more efficient entities, would receive more allowances than those whose emissions per unit of output are higher still. So those, and if you take those proactive approaches, the study found, you will end up likely avoiding any leakage of those emissions from your economy. And of course, avoiding emissions leakage is critically important. It's not only a bad economic outcome if output were to decline in those sectors and move to other locales, it's a bad environmental outcome because those emissions then leave the state and are going places where there aren't incentives in place to drive those emissions down over the long term. And we've seen success in other jurisdictions. I think we heard about that this morning for how you can use those allowance allocations selectively in those industries to achieve that balance between incentives towards further reductions over time, and maintaining competitiveness and maintaining the viabilities of those sectors as we go into this program.
Yeah, and I'll just add two things. First, I want to stress, and as Rajinder mentioned with respect to the California program, those, the level of direct allowances goes down over time, right? So, needless to say, there are a number of manufacturers who would prefer to be exempted from the program, but our preference is to have them under the program and put on, a steady diet, if I could call it that, over time to get to where we need to be. And, the primary industries that we're talking about, they are important industries for us here in Oregon, obviously. Pulp and paper, food processing, cement, steel, microelectronics. Those I think are some of the major industry clusters that are affected by this.
I would just add that it's important to note that these companies are located in both urban and rural areas. So this really isn't a split based on geography. These jobs are important to each of our communities. And I think that just want to reemphasize Senator Denborough's point because I think it's one that's lost on the larger population, that free is not going to be free. Free is just directly allocated to them so that they can make their own internal investment decisions about how best to bring down those reductions in line with the cap. Really big distinction that will be important in getting this conversation over the finish line.
I think that's right. I think the difference between exempting a source and putting it under the cap with some directed allowances is vastly different. You can maintain the environmental integrity of the cap as long as they're under it, and I think that's a very important point that's often lost. The issue of low-income households came up earlier today. And so I was just wondering how low-income Oregonians are figuring into your thinking about this and policy options.
I'm happy to hop in first and then. So, I think we are structurally a little bit different from other states. We can have some certainty on the electricity sector side with where investments will go because we have an oversight board that regulates their rates and can help direct some of those policy-making decisions. We, on the other hand, have a constitutionally dedicated highway trust fund, so transportation-related dollars around fuel have been directed there and for pretty much every other program that we've and bill that we've passed. That was a major tenet as part of the transportation package. That restriction on us was, I'll try to be less of a lawyer, Michael, here. I think it's more of a justiciable issue. I'm saying that badly. It's been a long time since I've been in law school, but it's certainly one that needs further clarification. After the transportation package was passed, a couple different sectors challenged the EV rebate as unconstitutional, that it should have been dedicated to the Highway Trust Fund. Our Supreme Court found that it was perfectly fine to charge additional costs on top of the hoods of all cars and then redirect that to EVs as a rebate. In their opinion, they added a couple different categories of types of costs that we might think largely within the transportation sector as related that may also not go into the Highway Trust Fund. So we're left with that unanswered larger question as we're putting this package together of investments. And I think we have a couple different moving components in putting this bill together that we'll be doing our best to forecast around and do our best to build a statutory program around, but there may be other factors that change out of our control in the future.
I would just add that, as we're thinking about implications for low-income communities with a cap and trade or a cap and vest style program, you have to look in two different ways, two different veins. So one is sort of, thinking about, the impacts in terms of, electricity rates, natural gas rates, and what does that mean for low-income communities? And that's why we've spent a lot of time and attention at looking at how do we do this with our, our electric utilities, our natural gas utilities, to ensure that, we don't leave anybody behind as we effectuate that clean energy transition. The other important piece of this, though, is making sure that as we do begin this clean energy transition, that we're providing everybody in Oregon with the opportunities to make that change. And so the ability to access energy efficiency technologies, weatherization in the transportation sector, making sure that, as we think about transportation alternatives, EVs, transit opportunities, that those are reaching all of our communities, and in particular our low-income communities, so that they have access to the alternatives, right? As we begin to send some clearer and clearer signals over time about the cost of fossil fuels. And so, it's finding the balance between those two things that's critically important. And I'll just add one of the pieces of work that was done over the last few months. The Carbon Policy Office and the governor asked our Housing and Community Services and our Public Utility Commission, and Julie Peacock's in the room here somewhere, and she did a phenomenal job pulling this group together to look specifically at, what's the current status of our low-income utility programs in Oregon, both natural gas and electric utility programs, public and investor-owned utility territories. How are those programs currently working? Who are they servicing? Where are there gaps and opportunities? And let's make sure we understand that as we look ahead to taking these next steps towards a clean energy transition. And some of the recommendations that came out of that working group, you'll see incorporated in the policy that comes forward.
Do you mind if I add one quick thing? Okay. And I think it's income inequality is showing up in every issue that we're working on this upcoming session. So the ways that our current Highway Trust Fund does constrain our ability to be a little bit more flexible with funds is not discounting that low-income issues and the issues of affordability are at the forefront of our minds across the board. Big issues before us will be revenue reform to fully fund our schools, particularly because we know that our communities of color and our low-income students struggle the most in large class sizes, and that's another big piece of our work in the upcoming session. Housing will be also be a big part of our work in the upcoming session. We know the housing crisis is not abated, and affordability is particularly pinched in our most rural areas where there isn't enough housing stock, and what there is increasingly deteriorating. These issues are very much linked, and the conversations we're having about them do intersect across all of these major priorities.
Yeah, and just to add to that, you know, I with Kristen sat in on the work group on the low-income utilities, and it was really illuminating. You know, we want to make sure that if we're making investments, we're not duplicating investments that are already out there, and not filling in the gaps that remain, right? And so it really is important to do this kind of gap analysis that this work began. And you know, we did see a lot of gaps around the state, especially in the more rural parts of the state, you know, in terms of their access to, you know, good weatherization programs, energy efficiency programs. And you know, of course, it'll be no surprise that where we see the toughest nut to crack is in multifamily, you know, low-income multifamily housing, rentals, trailers, you know, manufactured homes. And, you know, we are hoping that we can really put a focus of the program in that direction. Because then, I mean, ideally, you know, those 4 buckets that I mentioned before, ideally our investments are hitting as many of those buckets as possible. And I think those kinds of weatherization programs, you know, will, they'll result in less fossil fuel being used, right? So reducing emissions as the houses become tighter, and I will say a side benefit, healthier. You know, they'll also be, especially in the more rural parts of the state, we're going to see more extreme effects of climate change, you know, hotter summers, colder winters. And so having more, you know, better, more fuel efficient, energy efficient homes will help adapt to that reality. And then of course it will help keep low-income people from feeling, you know, the burden of the increased price being put on fossil fuels. And you know, I'm really, at the end of the day, who cares what the rate per therm or whatever is? I mean, I know Northwest Natural does, I know PGE does, but in terms of the customer, what they care about is their bill. And if, you know, if their bill remains the same or even goes down, that makes them happy, and it makes us happy.
I'll ask one more question, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. Senator Dimbro, you mentioned a moment ago that one thing we're good at is growing trees here in Oregon, and you know, typically things like forestry and agriculture are not included under the cap, which brings us to the issue of offsets. Can you somehow use this system to provide incentives for better land management through the program? And so I'm wondering if one of you could explain where we are on that issue and what you expect in the bill.
Yeah, I'm happy to. Maybe I'll ask Ken to come up. No, you don't have to come up. But we have been paying a lot of attention to offsets. We do see it as an important part of the program because we, for a number of reasons, one of which is that we have, this state is ripe for offset projects, you know, in our working lands particularly, you know, biodigesters, just a number of different things. And so it's important for us to keep it in the program. You know, at this point, it remains at the same level that I think where Quebec is and where I think California is currently. That is, it's an entity can meet their compliance obligations up to 8% through offsets. 4% of those have to be offset projects that directly benefit the state of Oregon. That is, that are, you know, think of projects like the one that our friends at Warm Springs are engaging in, that is going to the benefit of California programs right now. We want it to go to the benefit of Oregon programs. That kind of thing. I'll add a couple of things. You know, we also want to make sure that those offsets are good offsets, that they're really doing that they're legitimately offsetting emissions over the long haul. And we have and we certainly will have a protocol advisory group that is helping us with that. We're looking at ways to allow small landowners to aggregate their programs together, their projects, so that they can compete with the big guys. And our goal is to have the state help with that kind of aggregation. We also want to make sure that an entity that is not in compliance with its air quality permits, or that's located in an area that's compromised, whose air quality is compromised, is not using offsets to offset their emissions. They really need to reduce those emissions. So we've been thinking a lot about offsets and learning from the experiences of others. My sense is that the offset programs have really gotten a lot better over time, and I feel comfortable with it.
Great. Well, let's take some questions from the audience then. How about right down here in front? We'll have a microphone run over to you here. Could just identify yourself.
Yeah, John Malgren. I'm an attorney at the Western Environmental Law Center down in Eugene. I also teach a couple classes at the law school. I'm curious about whether the proposed legislation or anything under its umbrella will address export facilities or the potential for things that could have large emissions elsewhere, like the Jordan Cove LNG facility, where it's not emissions in Oregon, but it's passing through Oregon, and it's kind of those emissions are on our hands. So how that might fit in with the cap and trade program, if at all.
I'll do that, Kristen. Let you off the hook. One of the principles of carbon pricing is that each jurisdiction is responsible for its emissions, or the emissions that happen to its benefit, right? And so conceivably, if we were to have an export facility that had no emissions in the state, that would not be affected by the program. But if we're talking about, I think you mentioned an LNG export facility, that gas needs to be liquefied, and the liquefaction process requires a lot of power. And the one at Jordan Cove, when it was first proposed, they were talking about powering that through offshore wind. But the decision has been made, I think, for financial and other reasons, that they would burn gas to liquefy the gas. That would create emissions in a substantial amount, and that would be under the program. And I think there's some interest out there among the proponents of the program to have them considered EITEs, emissions intensive trade exposed, which is interesting because they don't yet exist. But the legislation specifically says that export or fossil fuel distribution facilities are not EITEs.
Great. Other questions back here?
I'm Steve Schell. I'm a public interest lawyer, and I'm a bit of a historian. It turns out that I'm familiar with the LCDC program and how the land use program put together. I had a hand in that parcel, and what happened in Washington frightens me, in that the carbon tax went down relatively easily in Washington. And the question is, can we prevent that in Oregon? And my suggestion is, have you thought about going to the public, not just confining your efforts to the legislature, but recognizing that the public needs to have a participation in this? Could the authority be one of the ways to reach out to the public, as we did, and we avoided 3 initiative repeals as a result of reaching the public? I think we need to think beyond the legislature at this point to Oregon's process of initiative. Have you thought at all about that?
So I think as the newest person to this conversation out of my colleagues who've been working on it for ages, the initiative petition system in Oregon is really interesting. I didn't grow up with it. We really love our citizen input, and that includes being able to refer things back out. We are putting together a program that must last in statute for decades. And at the same time, it's really hard to make legislation sound exciting to the external public, because that's just not the way that our laws read. I'm heartened by the fact that Portland bucked global or national trends in supporting strong clean energy work. And I think for me, that's my lodestar. Oregonians always like to fly a little bit differently than other states. And I'm not afraid of a group of citizens or industry who decide to refer this back out. Because I think here in Oregon, we are seeing the effects of wildfire smoke. We're seeing this impact basic necessities like drinking water. Portland stood up overwhelmingly, even in my precincts that are socioeconomically disadvantaged, and said, by well over 60% margins, said yes to the Clean Energy Fund, even if the threat that it might cost them additional money in their pocketbook proved to be real. We are ready for this program in this state. We're ready for this program nationally. We just don't have the national leadership to get us there. So I'm excited about Oregon doing it this year.
And I'll just add to that, Steve. Obviously, we've been thinking a lot about that question. And we believe that if we pass a good program, it's going to be hard to be overturned at the ballot. And you know, it's a lot easier to defeat something that's being proposed through the initiative system than it is to defeat something that has already gone through the legislative process. Definitely not impossible. We've all seen examples of it. But you get a sort of built-in level of support that way. And that together with, you know, what we see as an overwhelming degree of support around the state for tackling climate change, you know, we believe that if it goes through the legislative process, it will be defended at the ballot.
Great. Another question? Right here.
Hello, I'm Pat DeLaQuille, and I volunteer with 350 PDX. One of the most important aspects of this legislation is the cap. We would all, you know, especially given the recent reports from IPCC and from our own government about the severity of climate change, we would like to see as strong a cap as possible. Many of us would like to see a zero target in 2050. But I think the critical point here is whether we can maintain the state's goals, especially for 2035 and even the 2025 target that was in last year's legislation. I'd like to hear your opinions on that.
Yeah. So, you know, the bill that you'll see sometime before the end of the month does have the cap decline in alignment with our interim goals for 2035. And that's, what is that, 40%? No. What it, 45% below 1990 levels by 2035. and it will be structured in that way. So one of the things we haven't talked about is, at some point soon, we will be receiving back the study being done by Bear Analytics, which is looking at the economic impacts of the program around the state and in different industries, et cetera. And they are looking at, we've given them options. If we were to do it this way, what would be the effect? If we were to do it that way, what would be the effect? And that is a question that we're asking them. If we stay with our interim targets, what is the effect on emissions reduction and on the economy, economic repercussions? Or if we were to do a sort of steady decline from here to our 80% reduction target by 2050, what would that look like, both in terms of the environmental impacts and the economic impacts? I'm eager to see that. My hope is that we can defend the strongest possible environmental controls possible.
And I'm assuming that somebody's now tweeting this out into the larger sphere. I think in the context of this conversation in particular, it's been one that we've thought long and hard about, because we know we're not going to meet our goal that's up next. And I'm a former local city councilor. Nothing shakes the public's confidence in a system like setting a goal out there and then blowing it. And we really need some additional information to give us assurance that we're going to be able to meet those interim goals in a way that's going to be beneficial for our economy. I believe we'll be able to get there, but we do need some additional information back, and certainly a robust conversation around the actions we're going to have to take to get us to that point in the near term.
Great. And I think we had one more question over here in the audience. Is that? No. There's
here
some.
you go. Yep.
Hi, my name is Gordy Molitor. I'm with Our Climate and with the Citizens Climate Lobby. I'm a former community action director in my former life, and they run the weatherization programs and the utility relief programs. They're very important programs to specific households that meet the criteria. It doesn't cover every low-income person in a community. Anytime you tax energy, it's a regressive tax because low-income people spend a larger percentage of their income on energy. Is there anything in this bill that will address the other people that aren't going to get a cheap wood stove or their house weatherized, or they're behind in their utility bill and so they get some money?
Yes, in a word. Yes, there will be. I mean, my own preference would be that when we are providing rate assistance, we are first looking at weatherization, right? Because, we want to, we don't want to be assisting a leaky house, right? We don't want to, but I think the two can work really well together, and that is specifically called out as a priority in the bill.
Well, we're about at time. We'll end with one last question for each of you, which is predict a date by which the legislature will be done with this bill.
June 30th.
As usual, I'm going to be more ambitious. I would really like to see a ceremonial signing of this bill on Earth Day this year.
I've been outvoted.
They'll be done when they're done.
Okay, well, after that concludes this panel. Everyone is welcome to join us for lunch outside these doors. Please join me in thanking our panelists for this event.